The wind drifted low over the valley, carrying with it the faint clatter of iron and the crisp scent of late autumn. Mist curled in lazy threads along the edges of the forest, wrapping itself around bare trees and clinging to the stone walls of the small hilltop keep that overlooked the fields below. It was early morning, and the ground was still wet with dew. A few crows cawed in the distance, their wings slicing through the pale sky as they circled overhead, watching Dot in the quiet. Between the slow rise of dawn and the rustling of life inside the castle, a young man stood alone on the edge of the tiltyard. His name was Aldric, son of no great lord, but of a minor knight, one of many in a world where power came not from birth alone, but from strength, reputation, and the weight of one's sword arm. He was no stranger to training, nor to the sting of bruises or the sharp jolt of impact when metal struck bone. But what lay ahead of him this morning was no training. Today would not be about blunted swords and pulled blows. Today, for the first time in his 19 years, he would fight in a duel that could end with the man lying dead in the dirt. He looked down at his hands, wrapped tightly in worn leather gloves, then to the sword by his side, an old, serviceable blade his father had passed down, the edge still sharp, the crossguard dented from use. The scabbard hung low against his thigh, and when he moved, it tapped gently against his leg like a reminder, like a whisper, "You are no longer a boy." Behind him, the castle began to stir. The iron-studded doors of the gatehouse creaked open, and two men stepped out, their voices low, their cloaks drawn tightly against the cold. Servants followed, carrying small bundles and baskets, the necessities for a long morning at the field. It was not a grand event, no banners waving, no trumpets blaring. This was not a tournament or a king's feast. This was justice, or what passed for it in the eyes of the realm, an honorable settlement of accusation through trial by combat, sanctioned by the local lord and witnessed by his household. Aldric had not asked for this duel. He had not wanted it. But the moment his name had been called in the great hall 2 weeks prior, and the accusation thrown like a gauntlet at his feet, he had known the path ahead was set. A man named Bartram, a landholder of some note, had accused him of theft of taking a chest of silver coins from a storehouse during the foggy nights when the keep's watchman had been thinned by illness. There had been no witnesses, no hard proof. Only suspicion and motive and an ill-spoken word. In this world, that was enough. Bartram had offered the challenge before Lord Henrik himself, demanding the right of trial by combat. And though Aldric's father had protested, though the chamberlain had quietly urged him to settle by oath or fine, Aldric had stood and accepted, not because he was eager to fight, but because to refuse would be to wear the stain of guilt forever. The footsteps behind him grew louder. Turning slightly, he saw his father approaching, his face pale beneath the cropped gray beard, his lips pressed into a thin line. He wore a thick cloak and carried Aldric's helm beneath one arm. Beside him walked the family's old arms-master, a one-eyed veteran named Corwin, whose limp had worsened over the years, but whose mind remained sharp and unyielding. "You slept?" his father asked, though he already knew the answer. Aldric shook his head. "I tried." The older man gave a grunt, not quite disapproving, but not without concern. He handed the helm over and adjusted the belt at Aldric's waist, checking the buckle, tightening the strap by a notch. These were the quiet rituals of war, the careful habits of men who knew that steel cared little for fear or pride. Preparation was everything. "You'll keep your guard high," Corwin said, stepping forward and tapping Aldric's shoulder with the gloved hand. "Bartram favors a low lunge." He'll try to bait you. Don't fall for it. I remember, Aldric said. His voice was quiet, steady. The armsmaster studied him for a long moment. Good. And if he slips, if he leaves himself open, don't hesitate. That was the thing, wasn't it? Not hesitating, not thinking too long about what it meant to drive a blade into another man's chest, to watch the light go out of his eyes. Duels were not supposed to be to the death, at least not always, but they often ended that way, and Bartram was older, stronger, and had fought before. As the morning light brightened, the watchers began to gather along the edges of the field. A small wooden barrier marked the combat ground, roughly 30 paces in length and 12 wide. The ground was churned from practice and rain, muddy stretch with little cover, little mercy. Lords and ladies, servants and stable hands alike, found places to stand or sit, their eyes quiet with expectation. Few spoke, even fewer smiled. This was not sport, it was judgment. Lord Henrik himself arrived not long after, seated upon a low platform beneath a canopy, flanked by 2 guards in his colors blue and black, trimmed with silver. He raised a hand and the murmuring fell to silence. Bartram entered from the opposite end, his armor polished, his tabard clean, and bearing the emblem of his house, a golden stag on red. He looked larger than Aldric remembered, broader in the shoulders, his expression calm and unreadable. A squire walked beside him, carrying his shield and helm. When Bartram's eyes met Aldric's across the field, there was no hatred, no sneer, only certainty. The herald stepped forward, parchment in hand, and read the accusation aloud. His voice carried over the cold air, each word deliberate, binding. Theft, dishonor, trial by combat. He turned to Lord Henrik, who gave a slight nod. Let justice be served, the Lord said. A drumbeat sounded one slow strike, then another, and then silence. Aldric stepped into the ring. He could hear nothing but the sound of his own breathing. The world narrowed. He drew his sword, felt its familiar weight, the rough grip beneath his fingers. Bartram did the same. No shield, just sword to sword, man to man. The seconds slipped past, each one slow and sharp. Bartram moved first, a testing step forward, blade low. Aldric shifted to meet him, guard raised, knees bent. The rhythm of the duel began not wild or chaotic as tales often suggested, but measured, patient. This was not battle. This was dance, calculation, feints, parries, a flick of the wrist, a turn of the hip. The blades met with a hiss and a spark. Aldric blocked, then countered. Bartram stepped back, circling. His eyes never left Aldric's. They moved again, faster this time. A strike, a slide, metal screaming against metal. Bartram swung high, then low, and Aldric barely caught the second blow on the flat of his blade. His arms trembled with the force of it. Pain bloomed in his wrist, but he kept his stance. Around them, the crowd stood in perfect silence. Time passed differently in the ring. It stretched, warped, became something else entirely. Minutes felt like hours, each movement drawn out, each breath deliberate. Aldric began to see patterns, small tells in Bartram's shoulders, in the way his foot angled before each swing. He watched, learned, waited. Then Bartram made a mistake. It was small. A shift too far to the left, a lunge that overcommitted. Aldric saw the opening and moved without thought, his blade sliding beneath Bartram's guard, scoring a deep line along his opponent's side. Blood welled immediately, soaking the red of Bartram's tabard with the darker crimson. Bartram grunted, but did not fall. He stepped back, breathing hard, eyes flashing with renewed fury. The duel continued, and above them, The sky remained pale and still, as if the world itself held its breath. Bartram's blade dipped for just a moment as he stepped back, blood from his side dripping down in slow trails onto the earth. It wasn't a mortal wound, Aldric knew that, but it was deep enough to shift the rhythm of the fight, to take the strength out of Bartram's rightward swing. The older man adjusted his stance with care now, his weight redistributed to guard that side, the pain likely burning beneath his ribs. Still, he did not retreat. He came again, harder, more desperate. Now, and Aldric was forced to give ground. Their swords clashed again and again, the sound ringing out over the field like iron bells. Aldric felt his muscles burning with each parry, his legs aching from the mud that sucked at his boots. His breathing grew heavy, steam curling from his lips. The chill of the morning had long been forgotten. There was only fire now in the arms, in the chest, in the eyes. From the edge of the ring, Corwin's voice broke through the noise, low and sharp. "Don't chase. Let him come to you." Aldric obeyed instinctively. He shifted to the side, not pressing the advantage, not stepping in, letting Bartram tire himself. The older man's swings came with weight, but less precision. He was pushing through pain, through fear, though he tried to show neither. His jaw was clenched tight, his knuckles wide around the grip of his sword. And then another opening. This one even smaller, a fraction of a second when Bartram lifted his elbow too high during a backhand swing. Aldric ducked and lunged forward, his shoulder ramming into Bartram's chest, knocking him backward a step. The sword scraped between them, tangled for a breathless second, and then Bartram broke free, stumbling slightly, his boots sliding in the slick mud. But he did not fall. Around them, the crowd leaned forward, silent still, every face focused, every breath drawn. This was not the spectacle they'd imagined. It was not beautiful or poetic. It was not two knights exchanging clever blows in the sun-dappled yard. It was grim and exhausting. It was blood and bruises and the grind of worn metal. Bartram spat to the side, blood in the froth, and leveled his sword once more. "You've learned," he said, breathing raggedly. "You weren't this good last winter." Aldric didn't answer. He didn't feel like the boy he had been last winter. Everything about him had changed in the last 20 minutes. Bartram came again, and for a few heartbeats, their blades met in a dizzying series of strikes. Aldric blocked one too, then twisted into a rising slash that clipped the edge of Bartram's helm, sending it askew. The older man flinched, stumbled, but once again stayed upright. They separated, panting, each with arms trembling from fatigue. Behind Aldric, he could hear the voice of his father now, low and calm. "Finish it, son. Don't wait too long." But he couldn't just finish it. He didn't want to kill Bartram. He didn't want to be a murderer. But he also couldn't yield, not with the weight of justice hanging on this duel. To lose was to confess. To die was to admit guilt. In this trial, mercy could be mistaken for deceit. Bartram rushed again, faster than before, fainting low but coming high. Aldric barely ducked in time. The blade scraped across the top of his shoulder, slicing through the mail, but missing flesh. He turned quickly, caught Bartram's side again with the shallow cut, and retreated 2 steps. Mud sloshed beneath his boots. The mist was lifting now, revealing more of the fields beyond, the early sunlight catching on the dewy grass, turning the world golden. But inside the ring, time had no place, only breath and blade. The final blow came not with some glorious flurry or clever trick, but with fatigue. Bartram raised his sword again, but his footing failed, his heel slipping slightly in a pool of mud. It was small, almost nothing, but in the world of swordplay, where each heartbeat mattered. It was enough. His swing went wide. Aldric didn't hesitate this time. He stepped forward, brought his blade down across Bartram's arm, severing muscle. The older man cried out and dropped his weapon, clutching the wound. He fell to one knee. The crowd gasped not from shock, but from the rawness of it. There was no dignity in this ending, only reality. Aldric stood over him, blade ready, breath burning in his throat. "Yield," he said, voice rough. Bartram looked up. His eyes, no longer calm, were filled with pain, and pride, and defeat. "I yield," he said hoarsely. Silence. Then, from the raised platform, Lord Henrik rose. His voice rang out clearly, cutting through the air. "Justice is served. The accused is cleared. The matter is settled by the sword." And just like that, it was over. No fanfare, no cheers, just quiet. Aldric lowered his sword. The tremble in his arms caught up with him at last. His knees felt weak. The world spun slightly. His father was beside him in an instant, steadying him with a firm grip. Corwin followed, nodding once, approvingly. "You fought like a knight," his father said softly. "I'm not one," Aldric replied, barely above a whisper. "You are now." Bartram was taken away on a litter, arm-bound, face pale. He said nothing more. He did not look at Aldric again, and the crowd began to disperse. Some returned to their duties. Others talked in hushed tones about the duel, about the blood, about how close it had been. But no one questioned the outcome. In the eyes of the law, it was finished. But Aldric knew it would not leave him so quickly. Later, after he had stripped away the armor and washed in a cold basin behind the stables, he stared down at his hands still shaking, still blood-stained, and felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Not guilt, not pride, just weight. The kind that lingered long after the blade had been sheathed. The sun climbed slowly above the trees, and the morning became day. Life at the keep resumed, the duel becoming a memory before noon. But Aldric would not forget. His sword had spoken for him when his words could not, and in doing so, it had changed the shape of his future. He would never be a boy again, but he would not yet be a knight either. Not truly. Not until he understood what came next. For victory in a duel was only the beginning. That night, the great hall was filled with the soft hum of firelight and the clink of mugs as the household took its supper. Meat and bread, thick stew, and watered wine were passed down the tables. The duel was mentioned in low voices, now less tense, as if the telling of it helped dispel the heaviness it had brought. Aldric sat near the hearth, the heat warming his sore limbs, his tunic freshly laundered, the bruise beneath his collarbone already darkening. His father had spoken with Lord Henrik earlier, quietly, formally. He had not told Aldric the contents of the conversation, but Aldric suspected it had to do with land, with service, with what came after a duel fought in the name of justice. A figure approached and sat beside him. It was Marin the steward's daughter, a girl he had known since childhood. She looked at him with eyes not of admiration, but of knowing. She had seen the duel too, though from the back of the crowd, and she, unlike the others, had seen his hesitation. "You didn't want to kill him," she said simply. "No," Aldric replied. She nodded. "But you would have." He said nothing. There was no answer that felt right. "You fought well," she said, softer now. "And now they'll expect you to keep doing it." That truth settled between them like a weight in the air. He had won a duel. He had proven his innocence. But in doing so, he had also stepped into a new world, a world of violence, of reputation, of service to a lord who valued strength as much as loyalty. There would be more to come, more duties, more tests, and maybe, in time, a real war. But for now, there was only the fire, and the quiet, and the long road still unwritten before him. The days that followed blurred into one another, filled with quiet duties and long hours of watch. Aldric found himself caught between two worlds, now not quite a soldier, not quite a courtier. He rose early, just after the first bell, to break his fast with bread and cold cheese, then joined the other retainers in the courtyard for instruction under Corwin's watchful eye. There were drills at dawn and patrols at dusk. Sometimes they trained with blunted blades, sometimes with shields. Sometimes Corwin handed them wooden staves and blindfolds and told them to listen, to feel, to sense the footfall of another before it ever reached the ear. It was not enough to be strong. The arms master believed in awareness above all things. You can kill a man in the dark, he'd say, but you can't survive him unless you hear him coming. Aldric began to see the shape of his life more clearly now, the weight of it, the texture of it. His world was no longer just steel and stone and blood spilled in a ring. It was rules, observations, quiet nods exchanged in the corridor. He was learning to read men not just by their words, but by their silences. One misty morning, he rode with Jory to the southern border of Henric's land, tasked with delivering a sealed message to a reeve in a small village nestled near the bend of a slow-moving river. They left the keep before sunup, their horses kicking up clumps of mud along the forest path, breath steaming in the chill air. Jory spoke little. He wasn't unfriendly, just spare with words, as if he didn't want to waste them. The countryside was damp and quiet, thick with the scent of wet moss, and the low babble of brooks swollen with rain. Here, away from the stone walls, Aldric felt the pace of the world slow. The land moved according to its own rhythm. Fields stretched out in patchy browns and greens, sheep dotted the hillsides, and smoke curled lazily from cottage chimneys. They arrived by midday. The village was little more than a cluster of huts and a low stone church, its roof sagging with age. Chickens darted across the road. A bent old woman swept her threshold with a bundle of twigs. Jory dismounted and handed the scroll to a balding man in a woolen cloak who emerged from the church steps. "Tell him we'll return with Lord Henric's answer in 3 days," Jory said quietly. The reeve nodded, accepting the message without question. These weren't places where orders were debated. Out here, the Lord's word was law, carried by whomever he trusted enough to speak it aloud. They stayed the night in a lean-to beside the village inn, wrapped in their cloaks, their backs against their saddlebags. The stars above flickered between clouds, and somewhere beyond the trees, a fox barked once before silence reclaimed the woods. "You thinking of the duel?" Jory asked, not looking at Aldric. Aldric hesitated. "No," Jory nodded as if he knew better. "They never leave you." "Not really. You just stop seeing them when you close your eyes." They rode back the next morning, and Aldric said little more. But that night, as he lay in his cot in the barracks chamber beside the keep's outer wall, he dreamed again of the tiltyard, of Bartram's eyes, of the way the blade had felt when it struck bone. Not in fear, not in guilt, but as a memory he couldn't file away. It was part of him now. The seasons shifted slowly. The cold deepened. Leaves fell, blanketed the courtyard in gold and brown, then turned to rot beneath the boots of men training in the dawn. Light. The kitchens filled with the scent of boiled meat and dried roots. And still, Aldric served. He was sent to collect taxes from tenant farmers. He guarded the road when merchants passed through the woodlands. Once, he even accompanied Lord Henric's steward to a neighboring estate, where a dispute over land boundaries nearly came to swords before a compromise was arranged over water, ale and tense smiles. Through it all, Aldric watched how men stood when they lied, how they fiddled with their sleeves, how they shifted their weight. Corwin had taught him to read the rhythm of a fight, but Aldric was now learning to read the rhythm of people. And then, without warning, war came creeping from the north. It started with a whisper, a border skirmish between minor lords. 2 days ride beyond Henric's claim, a burned mill, a stolen flock. Then came the retaliation, a hamlet sacked in the night, a rider caught in the woods with 3 purses sewn beneath his cloak, 2 of them belonging to dead men. The council was called. Late that week, Aldric, standing with the other retainers along the hall's edge, listened as Lord Henrik paced before the hearth. I will not be drawn into a border war, the Lord growled, his fingers tight around a goblet. Let them burn their own crops and call it justice. My men are for my land, not theirs. His steward cleared his throat gently. With respect, my lord, if the conflict grows, it may not stay outside your borders. Then we'll see it when it comes. But it did come. Weeks later, 2 riders arrived just before dawn, mud-soaked and shivering, bearing news that a warband had crossed into Henric's southern farms and torched a barn. 2 men dead, 1 missing. Henrik didn't wait this time. He called his retainers to arms. Aldric, still just 19, found himself standing beside men twice his age, fastening the straps of his brigandine, tightening his gauntlets with fingers that shook despite the calm in his heart. This was no duel. This was no trial. This was war, and no law ruled here but the sword. They rode south in a line of 30, banners furled tight against the wind, hooves muffled by the misty ground. At the front rode Henrik, helm slung at his side, face grim. Corwin rode beside him, the old arms-masters, mouth drawn into a hard line. Aldric was placed in the second rank, just behind Fen, who carried a long axe across his back, and moved with the slow steadiness of someone who had faced blades before. They made camp at dusk beneath a copse of trees near the river bend, cooking oats over low fires and posting double watches. That night, Aldric sat sharpening his blade when Corwin approached and sat beside him. You'll ride close to me tomorrow, the old man said. Watch, but don't wander. This isn't the yard, and they won't yield. Aldric nodded. You frightened? Corwin asked, not unkind. No. The armsmaster studied him, then gave a slow nod. Good, but be cautious anyway. Courage, without caution, is just a fancy way to get dead. Aldric did not sleep much. None of them did. Dawn came with the pale grayness, the sound of distant birds, and the faint trickle of water over stones. Then came the signal. A scout returned just after sunrise, breathless and mud-covered. The warband was camped less than a league away, poorly guarded, half-drunk, not expecting a response so soon. Henrik gave the order without ceremony. They rode silently through the trees, then fanned out along the low ridge overlooking a clearing where smoke rose from scattered fires. The enemy camp was crude, no palisade, no structure, just tents, crates, and weapons scattered like careless thoughts. Henrik raised his hand, and the world changed. They descended like a storm, hooves pounding, shouts rising, blades drawn in the gray light. Aldric's heart thundered in his chest. As he kept his horse steady, eyes locked on the chaos ahead, the clash came fast. Screams, metal, confusion. Aldric saw Fen swing his axe into the shoulder of a raider, saw another man dragged from his horse and struck down before he could rise. A figure rushed toward Aldric, face half covered, spear raised. He blocked without thinking, turned the spear aside, drove his blade into the man's chest. The scream was short. The blood was warm. It was not like the duel. There was no honor here, only instinct, only survival. The fight lasted minutes, then it was over. Smoke curled from burning tents. Bodies lay twisted in the mud. The moans of the wounded echoed faintly beneath the trees. Henrik rode through the camp slowly, issuing orders, checking faces. Aldric stood very still, his blade low, blood on his sleeve, his chest rising and falling in sharp rhythm. "You did well," Corwin said, appearing beside him. "I did what I had to. That's what we all do." The wind picked up, scattering ash through the trees, and somewhere beneath it, the world turned again. The days that followed blurred into one another, filled with quiet duties and long hours of watch. Aldric found himself caught between two worlds, now not quite a soldier, not quite a courtier. He rose early, just after the first bell, to break his fast with bread and cold cheese, then joined the other retainers in the courtyard for instruction under Corwin's watchful eye. There were drills at dawn and patrols at dusk. Sometimes they trained with blunted blades, sometimes with shields. Sometimes Corwin handed them wooden staves and blindfolds and told them to listen, to feel, to sense the footfall of another before it ever reached the ear. It was not enough to be strong. The arms master believed in awareness above all things. "You can kill a man in the dark," he'd say, "but you can't survive him unless you hear him coming." Aldric began to see the shape of his life more clearly now, the weight of it, the texture of it. His world was no longer just steel and stone and blood spilled in a ring. It was rules, observations, quiet nods exchanged in the corridor. He was learning to read men not just by their words, but by their silences. One misty morning, he rode with Jory to the southern border of Henrik's land, tasked with delivering a sealed message to a reeve in a small village nestled near the bend of a slow-moving river. They left the keep before sunup, their horses kicking up clumps of mud along the forest path, breath steaming in the chill air. Jory spoke little. He wasn't unfriendly, just spare with words, as if he didn't want to waste them. The countryside was damp and quiet, thick with the scent of wet moss and the low babble of brooks swollen with rain. Here, away from the stone walls, Aldric felt the pace of the world slow. The land moved according to its own rhythm. Fields stretched out in patchy browns and greens, sheep dotted the hillsides, and smoke curled lazily from cottage chimneys. They arrived by midday. The village was little more than a cluster of huts and a low stone church, its roof sagging with age. Chickens darted across the road. A bent old woman swept her threshold with a bundle of twigs. Jory dismounted and handed the scroll to a balding man in a woolen cloak who emerged from the church steps. "Tell him we'll return with Lord Henrik's answer in 3 days." Jory said quietly. The reeve nodded, accepting the message without question. These weren't places where orders were debated. Out here, the Lord's word was law, carried by whomever he trusted enough to speak it aloud. They stayed the night in a lean-to beside the village inn, wrapped in their cloaks, their backs against their saddlebags. The stars above flickered between clouds, and somewhere beyond the trees, a fox barked once before silence reclaimed the woods. "You thinking of the duel?" Jory asked, not looking at Aldric. Aldric hesitated. "No," Jory nodded as if he knew better. "They never leave you. Not really. You just stop seeing them when you close your eyes." They rode back the next morning, and Aldric said little more. But that night, as he lay in his cot in the barracks chamber beside the keep's outer wall, he dreamed again of the tiltyard, of Bartram's eyes, of the way the blade had felt when it struck bone. Not in fear, not in guilt, but as a memory he couldn't file away. It was part of him now. The seasons shifted slowly, the cold deepened, leaves fell, blanketed the courtyard in gold and brown, then turned to rot beneath the boots of men training in the dawn. Light. The kitchens filled with the scent of boiled meat and dried roots. And still, Aldric served. He was sent to collect taxes from tenant farmers. He guarded the road when merchants passed through the woodlands. Once, he even accompanied Lord Henrik Steward to a neighboring estate, where a dispute over land boundaries nearly came to swords before a compromise was arranged over water, ale and tense smiles. Through it all, Aldric watched how men stood when they lied, how they fiddled with their sleeves, how they shifted their weight. Corwin had taught him to read the rhythm of a fight, but Aldric was now learning to read the rhythm of people. And then, without warning, war came creeping from the north. It started with a whisper, a border skirmish between minor lords 2 days. Ride beyond Henrik's claim, a burned mill, a stolen flock. Then came the retaliation, a hamlet sacked in the night, a rider caught in the woods with 3 purses sewn beneath his cloak, 2 of them belonging to dead men. The council was called. Late that week, Aldric, standing with the other retainers along the hall's edge, listened as Lord Henrik paced before the hearth. I will not be drawn into a border war, the Lord growled, his fingers tight around a goblet. Let them burn their own crops and call it justice. My men are for my land, not theirs. His steward cleared his throat gently. With respect, my lord, if the conflict grows, it may not stay outside your borders. Then we'll see it when it comes. But it did come. Weeks later, 2 riders arrived just before dawn, mud-soaked and shivering, bearing news that a warband had crossed into Henrik's southern farms and torched a barn. 2 men dead, 1 missing. Henrik didn't wait this time. He called his retainers to arms. Aldric, still just 19, found himself standing beside men twice his age, fastening the straps of his brigandine, tightening his gauntlets with fingers that shook despite the calm in his heart. This was no duel. This was no trial. This was war, and no law ruled here but the sword. They rode south in a line of 30, banners furled tight against the wind, hooves muffled by the misty ground. At the front rode Henrik, helm slung at his side, face grim. Corwin rode beside him, the old arms-masters, mouth drawn into a hard line. Aldric was placed in the second rank, just behind Fen, who carried a long axe across his back, and moved with the slow steadiness of someone who had faced blades before. They made camp at dusk beneath a copse of trees near the river bend, cooking oats over low fires and posting double watches. That night, Aldric sat sharpening his blade when Corwin approached and sat beside him. You'll ride close to me tomorrow, the old man said. Watch, but don't wander. This isn't the yard, and they won't yield. Aldric nodded. You frightened? Corwin asked, not unkind. No. The arms-master studied him, then gave a slow nod. Good, but be cautious anyway. Courage without caution is just a fancy way to get dead. Aldric did not sleep much. None of them did. Dawn came with a pale grayness, the sound of distant birds, and the faint trickle of water over stones. Then came the signal. A scout returned just after sunrise, breathless and mud-covered. The warband was camped less than a league away, poorly guarded, half-drunk, not expecting a response so soon. Henrik gave the order without ceremony. They rode silently through the trees, then fanned out along the low ridge overlooking a clearing where smoke rose from scattered fires. The enemy camp was crude, no palisade, no structure, just tents, crates, and weapons scattered like careless thoughts. Henrik raised his hand, and the world changed. They descended like a storm, hooves pounding, shouts rising, blades drawn in the gray light. Aldric's heart thundered in his chest. As he kept his horse steady, eyes locked on the chaos ahead, the clash came fast. Screams, metal, confusion. Aldric saw Fenn swing his axe into the shoulder of a raider, saw another man dragged from his horse, and struck down before he could rise. A figure rushed toward Aldric, face half covered, spear raised. He blocked without thinking, turned the spear aside, drove his blade into the man's chest. The scream was short. The blood was warm. It was not like the duel. There was no honor here, only instinct, only survival. The fight lasted minutes, then it was over. Smoke curled from burning tents. Bodies lay twisted in the mud. The moans of the wounded echoed faintly beneath the trees. Henrik rode through the camp slowly, issuing orders, checking faces. Aldric stood very still, his blade low, blood on his sleeve, his chest rising and falling in sharp rhythm. "You did well," Corwin said, appearing beside him. "I did what I had to. That's what we all do." The wind picked up, scattering ash through the trees, and somewhere beneath it, the world turned again. The road home was quiet. Horses walked slowly beneath a heavy sky, the weight of battle settling into silence like dust upon the shoulders of every man. Aldric rode near the middle of the line, his sword cleaned but not yet resheathed. It hung across his lap as if it were not yet done speaking. Blood had dried in the creases of his gloves, and though the taste of the morning's fight had faded from his tongue, the memory of it clung like the scent of ash. They left the clearing behind, without words. Lord Henrik had ordered the tents burned, the bodies buried shallowly in the soft, wet ground. He had not spoken much since. He wore the same expression he had during the duel a month earlier, watchful, composed, distant. His eyes never stayed long on the men they passed, perhaps because he had seen too many of them fall in places just like this. Aldric's thoughts wandered as the hooves of his horse thudded in rhythm with the rest. He remembered the look in the raider's eyes, the one he had struck down in the mud. Not rage, not desperation, just surprise, as if death had reached him before he had truly understood what was happening. Aldric wondered if he had worn that same expression the day of his own duel. If Bartram had seen it in him, there was no glory in it. Not here. The stories told of wars as though they were poems, clean, heroic, full of victory and purpose. But war was not a poem. It was cold hands and shallow breath. It was the way your arm burned long after the sword had stopped moving. It was a man dying alone in the corner of a broken tent while the world moved on without him. They reached the keep just before sunset, the sky painted with streaks of gray and soft gold. The guards opened the gates without question. The villagers watched from doorways, their eyes wide but silent. No one cheered. No one rushed forward to greet them. They had seen men return from war before. They knew the smell. They knew the silence. That night, the barracks were still. No songs, no laughter, just men sitting with their own thoughts, drinking little, eating less. Aldric sat on the edge of his cot, pulling off his boots with slow fingers. The floor beneath him was rough stone, cold even through the wool socks he still wore. Fenn entered, not long after, dropping onto his bunk with a low grunt. His shoulder was wrapped in linen, cut barely avoided earlier in the chaos. He didn't speak, but gave Aldric a small nod before leaning back against the wall. "I heard you held your ground, came a voice from the doorway. Corwin stood there, arms folded, watching them both. Aldric looked up. I didn't run. Good. Not running is the first lesson. You've learned it well. Corwin stepped inside, letting the door close behind him. He crossed the room slowly, boots echoing faintly in the gloom. The second lesson, he said, is knowing when to move anyway. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. He left them soon after, the door shutting softly behind him. Aldric lay back on the cot and stared at the beams above. The stone of the wall beside him was cool too. The touch. Somewhere down the corridor, someone snored softly. Beyond that, nothing. He slept lightly, as he had every night since the duel. In the morning, he was summoned. The message came with a page, a pale boy with a freckled nose and anxious fingers. Aldric followed him across the keep to a smaller chamber, tucked behind the main hall, a room used not for councils or audiences, but for quiet conversations. Lord Henrik was there, seated at a small table near the hearth, one hand resting on a map, the other wrapped around a cup of steaming broth. He looked up as Aldric entered. Sit, he said simply. Aldric did. The Lord studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the map. It was a hand-drawn depiction of the southern holdings, marked with ink lines and faded sigils. The men you helped drive off, Henrik said, were from beyond the river, the lands held by Lord Karen. Aldric nodded. He had heard the name. Not a great lord, but powerful enough to command men, dangerous enough to be taken seriously. They were likely hired, Henrik continued, not acting under direct orders. But that distinction doesn't matter if the raids continue. He traced a line on the map with one finger. This path here through the forest east of the bend. It's been used before. Old smuggler's route. I want it watched. Quietly, Aldric waited. The words were simple, but the meaning wasn't. You want me to go, he said. Henrik nodded. You and 2 others. Jory will lead. Fen will go as well. No colors, no crests. You'll stay 3 days. Report anything unusual. Aldric accepted the order with a slow breath. It was no longer strange to be chosen, no longer strange to be trusted. He was becoming something else now, something harder, something quieter. Before he left, Henrik leaned forward slightly. You're not a knight yet, Aldric. Not by title, but you carry yourself like one, and men notice. The compliment was unexpected. It settled somewhere deep in Aldric's chest, not as pride, but as weight. That afternoon, they rode again, this time without armor, without noise. The forest welcomed them with the same damp hush it always wore, and they followed the path not marked on any map, winding beneath branches that clawed at their cloaks and boots, that sank into softened earth. They found the smuggler's route easily enough. The old markers were still there, half-covered stones, twisted roots pulled aside long ago to make room for hooves or wagons. The place had not been used recently, but the signs remain. A broken bit of leather thong, a strip of cloth caught on a branch, the faint remnants of a fire buried beneath leaves. They made camp beside a half-collapsed stone wall that once marked the edge of a forgotten settlement. Only the base remained, moss-covered and worn smooth by years of rain. Aldric could almost picture the people who had once lived here, farmers, maybe, or exiles from some larger holding, long since swallowed by time. The first night was uneventful. They kept watch in shifts, each man sitting silently beneath the stars, eyes scanning the trees. There were sounds, of course, animals moving, the occasional crack of a distant branch, but nothing more. On the second night, they heard footsteps, not the scamper of deer or the flutter of birds, These were heavier, human, slow, careful. Aldric was on watch. He crouched low, one hand on his blade, the other motioning to Jory, who stirred beside the fire with quiet ease. They waited. Two figures emerged from the trees, neither armored, but both armed. They moved with purpose, speaking in hushed tones. One carried a bow, the other a satchel slung over his shoulder. They didn't see the watchers until it was too late. Jory stepped forward first, blade drawn. "Stay your weapons," he said. The two strangers froze. One reached for his hilt. Fen was on him in a breath, shoving him hard against a tree. "Poachers?" Aldric asked. "No," Jory murmured. "Too quiet, too prepared." He searched the satchel. Inside were notes, parcels, coins bearing a northern mark. "Messengers," Aldric said. "Or scouts," Jory replied. "They tied the men and sent one back under guard. The other they kept until morning, offering a crust of bread, little else." The man said nothing, just stared at the fire and waited. When they returned to the keep 2 days later, Henrik took the news calmly. The coin and notes told him what he already suspected. Trouble was coming, and Aldric, still so newly bound to this place, realized just how deep the roots of violence stretched beneath even the quietest soil. The duel had been the beginning, but now came the part that no songs were written about, the part where a sword was no longer enough. The snow came early that year, fine at first, like dust drifting down from the heavens, then thicker, heavier, clinging to the roofs and courtyards of the keep, like the slow settling of time itself. The forest turned silent beneath the white. It sounds muffled, as though the world had chosen to speak more softly. Footsteps vanished moments after they were made, and the breath of horses steamed in long, low clouds from their flared nostrils. Aldric stood in the northern watchtower on the second morning after the snow began, looking out across a land transformed. What had once been muddy fields and frozen paths now lay blanketed in a strange kind of peace. But it was a fragile thing, and he knew it. Peace was never still. It was always in motion, always waiting to be disturbed by the next rider, the next letter sealed in wax, the next whispered warning carried on cold air. He wore a thicker cloak now, lined with wool, and fastened by a simple bronze clasp. No sigil, no colors. He preferred it that way. The sword at his hip felt heavier in the cold, the leather grip stiff from frost. But it was there, as always, silent and expectant. Down below, the courtyard bustled quietly, servants hauling firewood, the blacksmith tending to horseshoes in a forge that hissed with steam each time snow fell across its edge. Smoke rose in plumes from chimneys, and the scent of burning peat mixed with that of roasting root vegetables. The keep was calm on the surface, but the calm had tension beneath it now, like a rope pulled taut. Henrik had not spoken openly of war since Aldric and the others returned with the scouts in tow, but his movements had changed. He consulted the steward more often. He met privately with messengers who arrived in the night. He trained more than he once did, short, quiet sessions in the practice yard with Corwin, neither speaking, both moving like men who understood what readiness truly meant. Aldric, too, trained more, not out of fear, not even out of duty, but because his body asked for it. There was no longer satisfaction in idleness. His limbs remembered the strike and clash of real battle. They craved motion, balance. Steel.it was during one of these sessions late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the keep's northern wall, that Corwin pulled him aside. "Walk with me," the old armsmaster said, handing Aldric a heavy cloak. They stepped out into the twilight, boots crunching softly over packed snow. The air was sharp and clean, and the breath between them came in quiet puffs as they walked beyond the inner gate and toward the old archery range near the edge of the orchard. Corwin didn't speak for a while. He carried a staff, walking slowly, but not with age, with thought. "You fought well in the glade," he said eventually. "I did what I was trained to do." "Not all who are trained can carry it through," Corwin replied. "Some flinch, some freeze. You didn't." Aldric waited, sensing more to come. "I watched your face when you killed the first one," Corwin continued. "Not proud, not shocked, just still." He stopped beside the low fence that marked the edge of the orchard, resting both hands on the staff and looking out at the white blanketed trees. "That's rare," he said, "and dangerous." Aldric didn't answer at first. He studied the curve of the land beneath the snow, the way the bare branches formed silhouettes against the pale sky. "I don't want to be dangerous," he said quietly. "You don't get to choose," Corwin said. "Not anymore. The sword chose you when you lifted it in front of witnesses. The duel confirmed it. The blood on your hands has named you. Now, you learn how to live with it." They stood in silence again. Corwin turned to him. "There's more to what we do than killing," he said. "A soldier is a blade. A knight is something else. Something heavier." Aldric met his gaze. "Will I be one?" he asked. Corwin gave a slow nod. "Likely, but not today." He turned and walked back toward the keep. Aldric followed. That night, Lord Henrik summoned him again, this time to the solar, where maps were now always present, their edges curling near the warmth of the hearth. The room was dim, candles burning low, the sound of wind rattling the shutters. Henrik sat with another man older, dressed in travel-worn furs, his boots streaked with dried mud and snow. His beard was iron gray, his eyes alert. "Aldric," Henrik said, "this is Sir Orwin of Devrest, a man I trust." Aldric inclined his head in silent respect. Sir Orwin studied him a moment. "You're the boy who beat Bartram?" he asked. Not unkindly, Aldric nodded. "He fought in 3 border wars and came back from each," the knight said. "That's no small thing." He yielded. Aldric said. Sir Orwin smiled faintly. "Even more telling." Henrik leaned forward. "There's a gathering near the town of Brentful. Lords from 3 houses. They claim it's a feast to mark the winter solstice, but I suspect it's more." He tapped the edge of the map. "I want eyes there." "You want me to go?" Aldric said again. "Yes. You and Orwin." Sir Orwin raised an eyebrow, but didn't object. "You'll pose as his squire," Henrik said. "No one will question it. You'll watch, listen, report what they speak of behind the wine and meat." "When do we leave?" Aldric asked. "Dawn." The journey was cold and long. They rode cloaked and hooded, keeping to forest roads when they could, taking shelter in crumbling chapels and way stations left over from older times. Sir Orwin spoke little on the road, but when he did, it was with intention. "Lords talk when drunk," he said once as they made camp, "but their truth is in what they don't say." They reached Brentful on the 3rd day, a town half buried in snow, its market stalls shuttered, its inn crowded with horses and banners. The feast was held in the hall of the local reeve, a wide stone building with rushes on the floor and smoke lingering thick beneath the beams. Aldric moved silently through the crowd, filling goblets, clearing trenchers, listening. The lords spoke in riddles, half-jokes about broken borders, subtle complaints about supply lines. But beneath it all, Aldric sensed something forming, a plan, an alliance. The way voices leaned closer, the way eyes flicked toward certain men at certain moments. It was not war yet, but it was its shadow. That night, in a cramped chamber above the stables, Aldric and Orwyn compared notes. "They speak of Lord Henrik as if he's already weakened," Aldric said. "They want his land," Orwyn replied, "or his silence." He studied Aldric's expression. "You hear more than most. I've learned to listen. That will serve you better than a sword ever could." They returned to the keep for days later. Henrik took the news with his usual calm, but his orders changed. Scouts were doubled, supplies stockpiled, a message sent to the crown, and Aldric, still barely more than a boy by years, stood now in the inner ring of those who held the Lord's confidence. He did not seek it, he did not boast of it, but he did not turn away either, because he had crossed the threshold, now drawn into the current that carried all men who served something greater than themselves. And the snow kept falling, soft, silent, unrelenting. The snow began to melt in patches, turning the courtyard into a soft mess of slush and mud. Long icicles hung from the eaves of the chapel and barracks, dripping steadily as the days grew longer and the wind lost some of its bite. Spring was still far, but the first hints of it crept into the land, the cry of birds returning to the forest, the pale green shoots rising through frost-blackened soil. Aldric stood near the edge of the practice yard, watching the new recruits fumble with their blades. Two were sons of minor landholders, sent by their fathers in hopes of earning a place in Henrik's house. The third was a miller's boy from the northern hamlets, awkward and eager, always asking questions. Corwin had assigned Aldric to oversee them for the week, not because of rank, but because of trust. "Don't swing from the shoulder," Aldric said, walking calmly behind the line of boys. "The blade isn't a hammer. Feel the weight. Let it move with you." One of the squires, a round-faced boy named Teb, tried again, his boots sliding slightly in the mud. Aldric caught his wrist gently. "Too fast. You're fighting your own weapon." Teb nodded, cheeks flushed, and tried again. Aldric had not realized how much he remembered until he began teaching it. The rhythm of stance, the balance of breath, the flow of motion. It had become muscle now, not instinct. Not art, just repetition embedded in bone. The kind of memory that never left. Corwin watched from the bench near the wall, sipping something hot from a wooden cup. He said nothing, but his nod was enough. Later that morning, Aldric was summoned again, not to the solar this time, but to the small chamber beside the chapel. It was quiet there, the stone floor swept clean, the windows narrow and arched. "Lord." Henrik stood at the far end beside a wooden table, where an unrolled parchment lay weighted by two iron candle holders. A priest stood beside him, fingers clasped, eyes downcast. "You're leaving again," Henrik said without looking up. "Tomorrow?" Aldric stepped forward, his boots echoing lightly. "Where to?" "North. A village called Gratham." One of the reeves sent word of strangers, asking questions about troop numbers, supply routes, names of lesser knights. "They claim to be tradesmen, but that doesn't fit." He tapped the parchment with one finger. "I want you to ride with a companion, someone who knows the roads and the people." The priest stepped forward now, and lifted his hood. It was Joran, the older monk who had once tended the injured and copied records in the keep scriptorium. Aldric remembered him faintly from when he was younger, always quiet, always working, never far from ink and parchment. "I asked Joran to go because he's trusted by the villagers," Henrik said. "He's seen as neutral." A squire asking questions would draw notice. A monk offering prayers does not. Aldric nodded. "When do we leave?" "First light." That night, Aldric packed lightly a blade, a flask of oil, thick cloak. Joran had no armor, only his robe, a walking staff, and a satchel of herbs and paper. They rode at dawn, the road still stiff with frost, the sky a pale smear of color. Behind clouds, the journey north was quieter than most. Joran spoke only when spoken to, and when he did, his voice was soft and low, like parchment rustling in candlelight. "You've seen war," he said after the first hour. Aldric nodded. "You've killed." Again odd. "And it still lingers." Aldric glanced over. "Do you ask because you're curious, or because you disapprove?" Joran smiled faintly beneath his hood. "Neither. I ask because I've seen what it does to men. Some grow harder, some fall apart, some carry the faces with them for the rest of their days." "I don't carry faces," Aldric said. "Just moments." "That's enough," Joran said. "That's all it takes." They reached Gratham by nightfall on the second day. A small village, barely 30 houses, 2 smokehouses, a stone bridge spanning a slow-moving stream. The fields beyond were half frozen, the sheep tucked away in low barns made of sod and wood. No banners flew, no soldiers stood watch, just the ordinary rhythm of survival. Joran went to the chapel immediately, speaking with the local friar, a round-bellied man with tired eyes and cracked hands. Aldric stabled the horses and walked through the village, hood up, watching. He saw no sign of foreigners, no signs of soldiers, but something about the place felt off. Too still, too polite. In the tavern that night, he kept to the corner, sipping weak ale and listening. Farmers spoke of a poor harvest, of spoiled grain, wolves coming closer to the hills. But beneath it, there was something quieter, a hesitation, as though every sentence was weighed before being spoken. Later, Joran joined him. "They've been here," the monk said softly. "2 men, arrived a week ago, claimed they were from the capital, looking to buy wool and tallow. But they asked too many questions. They left 3 days ago, heading east. Traders with no goods," Aldric said. "Exactly. They stayed another night, just in case." Aldric walked the perimeter in the early hours, the stars cold and bright above him. When he returned to the chapel, he found Joran writing something with the charcoal stub on the back of an old scrap of parchment. "What are you writing?" "Names, places, patterns. You think they'll return?" "They always do." They rode out the next morning, following the tracks east until they faded into the woods. Somewhere beyond the hills, the strangers would be speaking to others, asking questions, preparing something no one yet dared name. When they returned to the keep, Henrik was in the hall, speaking with 2 knights Aldric did not know. He pulled him aside afterward. "Well, they were spies," Aldric said. "Careful, but not clever. Someone is gathering information." Slowly, quietly, Henrik stared at the hearth for a long time. "Then we must move before they do." "What would you have me do?" Henrik turned, eyes sharp. "Train the others, the younger ones, not for the yard, for what's coming, for war, for what comes before it," Henrik said. "The part with no banners and no rules." And so Aldric began again, training not with wooden blades, but with real steel. Not in open fields, but in the quiet places beneath the archway behind the kitchens, in the narrow passages above the stables, where shadow was more useful than sunlight. He taught Teb and the others how to move silently, how to listen, how to read a lie on a man's lips before he spoke it aloud. He did not do it with joy, he did not do it with pride, but he did it with precision, because the world had shifted once more, and he could feel it underfoot. A slow, grinding turn. Something was coming, and this time it would not arrive in the form of a single duel. The nights grew quieter, but never truly still. The keep, once a place of steady routine, now moved with the kind of quiet urgency, like breath drawn in and held just before the moment of release. Scouts left before sunrise and returned after dark, their horses flecked with mud and sweat. Messengers came and went under false names, bearing seals that were broken behind closed doors and never mentioned again. Aldric had taken to walking the outer walls in the late hours, when even the hearths in the servants' quarters had burned low. He walked not out of fear, but out of habit now, his feet drawn to the familiar stone, the rhythm of boot against frost-covered ground. The moon lit the battlements in silver, and from up there he could see the forest stretching out like a dark, sleeping animal, its breath rising faintly in tendrils of mist. One night, as he leaned against the wall near the north tower, Corwin joined him. The old arms-master moved slower these days, but with no less purpose. He brought a flask of warm wine and offered it without a word. They stood in silence for a while, watching the tree line. "You feel it too?" Corwin asked finally. Aldric nodded. "Like the air's about to break. It always feels like this, just before things turn." They passed the flask between them. Corwin spoke again after a moment. "You're not just a blade anymore. Not even a knight, really." Aldric looked over. "Then what am I?" Corwin didn't answer. He just tapped his temple gently. "You see too much now. You don't move like someone waiting for orders. That's how it starts." They stayed on the wall until the cold crept into their bones and silence stretched too long to stay in. The next day brought news. A rider came, not in haste, but with eyes drawn tight and voice low. He spoke only to Henrik and the steward, and whatever was said sent ripples through the hall that no one acknowledged but everyone felt. That evening, Aldric was summoned once again, not to a council, but to the war room, where candles burned low and maps lay pinned beneath stones and bone-carved weights. Henrik stood by the hearth, his back to the door. When Aldric entered, the lord didn't turn. "There's to be a gathering," he said. 5 days from now. A feast. A contest." Aldric waited. "It will be hosted by Lord Karen," Henrik continued. "The one who sent the men across the border last month." That name again. The weight behind it more felt than spoken. "He's issued a challenge. A duel." Aldric felt something shift in his chest. "Against who?" Henrik turned now, his eyes calm. "Me." There was silence. "I'm not the man to meet him in the circle," Henrik said. "Not anymore." He stepped forward and placed a hand on the table, where a small wooden piece marked the location of Karen's estate. "He wants a contest of champions. One for honor, one for pride, one for what he calls justice. But it's not about justice. It's about sending a message." He looked directly at Aldric. "And I need to send one back." The understanding settled like ash. "You want me to fight?" "For you," Aldric said. Henrik nodded once. "You've already fought for your life. Now, you fight for something more." Aldric said nothing at first. He watched the fire in the hearth, watched how it moved, how it never stopped moving. "Who is he sending?" he asked. Henrik took a breath. "A man named Calred, a hedge knight, from the eastern marches. He's fought in 9 duels, killed in 5. He's no brute, but he doesn't stop." Aldric nodded slowly. "I've heard of him." "Then you know what you face." Aldric did not flinch. "Send word," he said. "I'll be ready." The days that followed moved differently. Training resumed, but not with blunted blades. Corwin oversaw it himself, bringing out weapons wrapped in oiled cloth, their edges gleaming. The yard was cleared of onlookers, and Aldric trained alone, no partners. no squires. Just motion, just rhythm. He fought as if the world depended on his calm. Each strike followed breath. Each step followed silence. Corwin watched with something like reverence. "You're not fighting him," the old man said once. "You're fighting yourself. That's good. That's how you win." On the morning of the 5th day, Aldric dressed in silence, not in armor, not yet. Just a tunic of dark wool, a plain belt, and boots polished not for vanity, but for precision. His real sword, rested in its scabbard beside his bed. He buckled it quietly, then looked out the window at the courtyard below. Men were gathering, horses saddled, banners furled. The ride to Karen's holding would take most of the day. As they rode, the landscape unfolded with slow, deliberate grace. The snow had thinned, giving way to patches of bare earth, and the first signs of thaw. Trees stood like witnesses along the roadside, their bare limbs stretched like arms too long held aloft. Ravens circled in the distance. Somewhere behind them, smoke drifted upward from the keep they had left behind. They reached the estate at dusk. Karen's holding was larger than expected, tall walls of dark stone, a central keep that rose like a clenched fist above the courtyard. Guards lined the ramparts, and servants bustled between stables and kitchens. But the welcome was cold. No feast, no music, just quiet stares and measured words. They were shown to guest chambers, simple but clean. Aldric sat by the window and watched the snow fall again, soft and thin, as if the world had forgotten how to storm. That night, Karen visited Henrik briefly. The door stayed closed. No words were shared outside. In the morning, the duel ground was prepared. It wasn't a tiltyard. No gallery, no banners, no roaring crowd. Just a ring marked in earth at the edge of the wood, quiet and cold. The sky hung low and gray above them, and the breath of every man watching hung like ghosts in the air. Conrad stood across the ring, tall, lean, wearing a breastplate etched with faint lines, more scarred than polished. He looked at Aldric not with hatred, but with the calm certainty of a man who had killed many times. Aldric stepped forward, blade unsheathed. No words were exchanged. There was no need. The duel began. Conrad moved first, testing, light-footed, circling like a dancer. His blade came in low, then high, then low again. Strike fast, but controlled. Aldric parried, stepped, breathed. Let the motion pass through him. He didn't fight with anger. He didn't fight with fear. He fought with memory. The training yard, Corwin's voice, Bartram's face, the glade, the snow, the quiet conversations with Henrik when no one else listened. The weight of a sword carried not for pride, but for promise. Minutes passed, then something shifted. Conrad pressed harder. His movements grew tighter, more aggressive. A cut grazed Aldric's sleeve. Another chipped his guard. Then Aldric saw it, a moment's rhythm, a tell, the half-step before the feint. He moved faster than thought. Steel rang. Conrad faltered. Another strike, a reversal, then silence. Conrad fell, not dead, but bested, on his knees, breath ragged, blood dripping from his forearm where Aldric's blade had struck deep. He did not rise. The ring remained still. Karen, watching from the edge, gave no signal, but Henrik stepped forward, hand raised. "It's done." Aldric stepped back, blade low. There were no cheers, just the wind. They left that evening. On the ride home, no one spoke, but Aldric felt it now. He had crossed another line, one less visible than the ring of dirt, but far more permanent. He was no longer just a sword. He was a message. The snows did not return that year. What fell from the sky came soft and scattered, then melted by morning, leaving the land wet and expectant. By early spring, the paths were firm again, and the trees began to change, first with buds, then with pale leaves like hesitant promises. The keep, too, changed with the season. Banners were mended, arrow stocks replenished. The stables smelled of fresh straw and iron, and Aldric, still quiet, still steady, found himself changing with it. He was known now, not widely, not in ballads or on tongues in distant towns, but within the walls and among the men who mattered. They watched him differently, with respect, but also with distance. The kind of distance one offers not to lords or legends, but to men who walk too close to danger too often. The kind who survive things others only speak of in low tones. The duel with Calred was not spoken of aloud, not by Henrik, not by the guards who had watched, not even by Colwyn, but it had left its mark. The squire, Teb, once too quick with questions, now paused before speaking to him. The miller's boy, Garin, who had once asked to borrow his practice blade, now nodded silently when passing by, as if some part of Aldric had hardened past familiarity. He trained still, daily, alone when he could. The edge of his blade grew finer, and his movements lost what little flourish they once had. There was no room for performance anymore, only precision. Henrik called on him more often now, with orders, but with thoughts. The Lord would send for him late, sometimes just before the last bell, and they would sit in the solar beside a low fire, maps between them, wax dripping from uneven candles. The window cracked to let in the scent of damp stone. "They are waiting," Henrik said one night, his voice steady. "Karen will not act yet, but he wanted to measure us, and you showed him we are not weak. Do you think it will be enough?" Aldric asked. Henrik turned to look out the window. "No, but it buys us time." "Another evening," he said, "when I was your age, I thought the blade was the answer, that if you struck true and stood tall, the world would bend around you. I know better now." He looked over then, the lines on his face deepened by firelight. "But I also know that when the blade is used rightly, it becomes something more than fear." That same night, Henrik handed him a ring, plain, iron, unadorned except for the smallest engraving on the inside, a sigil Aldric recognized only because he had seen it before, once, stamped in wax on a letter no one had been allowed to read. "If I fall," Henrik said simply, "ride south with this. Show it only when you must. It will open doors." Aldric took it without ceremony. No oaths, no promises, just understanding. Then came the fire. It was not within the keep, but beyond the ridge 3 leagues north, in a village called Brambleholt, known mostly for its barley and stone quarries. Smoke was spotted at midday. By the time riders arrived, half the village had been turned to ash. No invaders remained, no bodies left behind, just burned timbers, the smell of soot and silence. Aldric rode there with Jory and 2 other men. They scoured the perimeter, searching for tracks, signs of struggle. What they found instead were deliberate things: footprints swept clean, torch marks in strange patterns, a broken wheel left by the well that had no reason to break unless someone had wanted to block the water. It wasn't bandits," Jory said quietly. "They took nothing." "Oh," Aldric agreed. "They just wanted to send a message." That message arrived 2 days later. A scroll, sealed with dark red wax bearing the sigil of Lord Karen. The words were few, formal, and cold. He demanded a trial of loyalty. One of Henrik's bannermen, Sir Diran of Fallows Rise, had, he claimed, crossed into Karen's lands without cause. taken supplies, and ridden out by night. Durin denied it, swore on relic and altar alike, but Karen demanded justice, a duel. Again, but not between lords, between captains. Henrik turned to Aldric once more with command, but question, and Aldric, without needing to be asked, said, yes. This time it was to be fought not on Karen's land, but on a neutral field, a cleared glade between holdings, near a ruined watchtower long since claimed by moss and ivy. The date was set, 10 days, enough time for witnesses to gather, enough time for the wind to shift. As the day approached, Aldric prepared not with blade alone, but with thought. He visited Durin, listened to his story, not because he doubted him, but because he knew now that duels were not about victory. They were about truth, and the shape of the lie wrapped around it. Did you cross the border? Aldric asked once. Durin shook his head. I sent a boy to trade for salt. Nothing more. Did the boy ride under your name? Durin hesitated. No, he wore a plain cloak. But they knew. Yes. Then Aldric understood. It wasn't about the salt. It was about the pretext. Karen wanted blood, and he knew exactly how to ask for it. On the morning of the duel, Aldric dressed simply leather over mail. No colors, no crest. He wore the same sword, not because it was his best, but because it was his. They rode out at dawn, the path winding through frost-crusted grass, and beneath trees that shivered with wind. The glade lay open under a gray sky, the ruined tower watching like a bent sentinel. Karen's men were already there, too many for peace, just few enough to call it formal. His champion was a man named Revik, broad, with a thick beard and a chain tunic stained by age. He carried a long-handled axe, not because it was elegant, but because it broke things. The duel began without ceremony. There were no horns, no calls, just the two of them, stepping into the ring. Aldric watched Revik's stance, wide, deliberate, heavy on the back foot, the kind of stance meant for power, not speed. The first blow came hard. The axe swept wide, catching air where Aldric had just stood. He stepped in, struck low, felt the clang of blade against mail, then stepped out again. Revik turned slower than expected. The axe came again, this time a feint. Aldric didn't bite. Then the real fight began. The air was full of breath, and grunts, and the sound of steel. No cheers, no calls, only the watcher's eyes, quiet and unblinking. The fight stretched on longer than most. Revik took a cut to the shoulder, Aldric a bruise to the ribs. Then, finally, a moment, Revik stepped heavy, too heavy. The axe dipped low. Aldric moved in. Steel-kissed flesh. Revik dropped. The duel was done. Karen said nothing. He turned and rode away, his cloak flaring like a flag no longer raised. Henrik said nothing either. He only nodded once. The ride home was long, but the silence on the path felt lighter than usual, because the world had tilted once again. Aldric had survived another duel, but more than that, he had chosen to stand. The days following the duel passed with a peculiar stillness, as if the air itself was waiting. The wind blew softer, the night seemed longer, and within the stone halls of Henrik's keep, people moved with a gentler caution. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was the kind of silence that grows in the corners of rooms and beneath stairwells, just before someone speaks the thing no one wants to hear. Aldric spent most of those days in motion. He trained at dawn, walked the ramparts by mid-morning, helped the steward take count of arms and grain in the afternoon, not because he was ordered to, but because stillness made the mind too loud. And lately, Aldric's thoughts had sharpened into something harder than worry. He had begun to see how the duels were not about justice, or truth, or even power. They were performances, carefully staged, meant to test not just strength, but message. He was the message now. His blade, his silence, his steadiness, and Karen had received it. But what disturbed Aldric more was not Karen's retreat, but his quiet. He said nothing. He sent no letters. He challenged no further. And that, Aldric knew, was not peace. It was planning. Henrik knew it too. One morning, the Lord summoned him to the stables, where a man in a dark cloak waited beside a horse so lean it looked carved from bone. The man's beard was short, his eyes dark. His name was Harlan, and he had once served as a royal courier, riding between courts with letters that changed the fate of men. He rides for the capital, Henrik said. And you'll go with him? Aldric raised an eyebrow. To deliver what? Henrik handed over a sealed scroll. To warn them. Karen will not strike here. He'll strike in the south, where the lords squabble over grain taxes and forget that borders don't hold against steel. Aldric took the scroll and tucked it into his satchel. He didn't ask what was written. He already knew enough. They rode at twilight, cloaks drawn tight, hooves muffled by the thawing road. Harlan was not a man of many words. He spoke only to mark danger, or to point out a better path through the low woods and gullies. They slept in ruins, in chapels long abandoned, or in the lofts of silent farmers who recognized their lord's colors, but asked no questions. It took them 4 days to reach the outer edge of the southern road. On the 5th day, smoke rose on the horizon. Harlan spotted it first. A village, he said, pulling his horse to a slow halt. Too much smoke for cooking. Aldric's jaw tightened. They pushed forward. What they found was a village blackened by fire timbers still glowing. Ash caught in the wind like snow. No banners, no bodies, just absence. And in the center of the charred square, a single spear driven into the earth. On it, a strip of cloth gray and red. Karen's colors. He's not striking Henrik, Aldric said, voice low. He's striking Henrik's friends, and waiting to see who steps away first. Harlan added. They rode faster now, barely resting, pushing south until the capital walls rose before them tall and white, etched with soot and history. Inside, the streets were full of early spring bustle, tradesmen unloading wool and flax, butchers calling prices, crows perched atop bell towers watching with idle judgment. But when they reached the Hall of Petitions, everything changed. The guard, who took Henrik's scroll, did so with a nod, but his eyes were unreadable. You may wait, he said. So they waited. Hours passed, then a day, then 2. No summons came. On the 3rd day, Aldric and Harlan sat beneath the southern cloister of the court square, eating bread that had gone hard. It was quiet there. A young girl chased pigeons near the fountains, and a drunk slept beneath the statue of the first crowned king. They don't want to listen, Harlan said finally. Not yet. They think Karen's still loyal, because he hasn't broken the rules, Aldric said, because they're afraid if they admit what's happening, they'll have to act. That night, Aldric wandered the streets alone. He passed taverns where merchants laughed too loudly, where soldiers played dice and cursed taxes. He passed temples where candles burned low, the smell of tallow and old flowers thick in the air. And in a quiet square near the tailor's quarter, he found a notice board where a parchment fluttered in the breeze. It was a list of names, dead from the border skirmishes, unacknowledged and unmourned. He didn't know any of them, but he stood there, for a long time. When they returned to the keep a week later, things had already changed. Henrik had sent out riders not to attack, not to defend, but to call in his oaths. One by one, his allied houses responded. Some came quickly, some sent letters instead of swords. Some sent nothing at all. In the hall, a new map had been hung, its corners nailed directly to the stone wall. It was marked not with borders, but with lantern pins, black for silence, green for support, red for known betrayal. Aldric saw more black than green. Karen had begun to turn the wheel, and it would not be long before it crushed something. At dawn the next morning, Aldric returned to the yard not for practice, but for instruction. He gathered the younger squires and began to walk them through shield formations, through routes to escape over back walls, through signs of poison, of sabotage, of strangers who watched too long and spoke too little. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for attention. He simply showed them what would matter when the world began to collapse. By mid-spring, Henrik gave the order. No official war, no formal march, but the gates of the keep were sealed. Visitors were questioned. Letters read. Lanterns lit at night along the high walls. Aldric slept only a few hours each night, often beside the barracks fire, boots still on, blade within reach. Once, in the quietest part of a fading evening, Corwin found him sharpening his sword by the stable wall. "You're not ready," he said. Aldric looked up, surprised. "You think I can't win?" "I think you're still thinking in terms of duels." Corwin sat beside him, staring at the stone floor. "This won't be circles drawn in dirt, lad. There won't be rules. There won't be honor. You'll look at a man and not know if he's your ally or your killer, and you'll need to decide." In a breath, "I'll be ready," Aldric said quietly. Corwin didn't nod, didn't smile. He only said, "Let's hope that's enough." The next morning, a rider approached the gates bearing a letter. The guard took it carefully. When Henrik opened it, his eyes narrowed. Karen had called for another duel, but not between lords, not between champions. This time, it would be between brothers. Karen's younger cousin Lazaric had insulted a minor house that still owed fealty to Henrik. The insult had been public, loud, and cruel. And now the younger son of that house had demanded satisfaction. He was 17. He had never held a sword in real battle. Karen had agreed. The duel was scheduled in 5 days. Aldric knew immediately. It wasn't about blood. It was bait. He knew it because he recognized the pattern now. Draw them out, break them apart, and it would fall to him, once again, to decide whether that trap would be sprung or shattered. They called it a duel, but everyone knew it was T.by the time Aldric stood at the edge of the old orchard, where the trees grew gnarled and low to the earth. The word had already begun to lose meaning. A duel was meant to be equal, agreed upon, understood, but this was something else, designed to humiliate, not settle. It was bait for something larger, hidden behind the thin veil of tradition. The boy stood 20 paces away, 17, perhaps 18. His name was Saren, and he had volunteered or been pushed to defend the honor of his house. He wore borrowed mail that didn't quite fit, and his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the grip on his sword. He tried to hide it, but Aldric saw. Everyone did. Across from him, Lazaric stood relaxed, smiling faintly. Tall, cruel-faced. His polished armor gleamed beneath the pale spring sun. His gauntlets bore the sigil of Karen's house, a serpent circling a crown. His sword was longer than it needed to be, and the way he held it said he didn't expect to lose. Aldric stepped back from the ring's edge and stood beside Corwin. Behind them, the hill sloped upward toward a crowd that had come not for honor, but for spectacle. Nobles, minor knights, household guards, some with wine, some with bread, A few with eyes already narrowed in disgust. The horn sounded. Saren moved. First, blade lifted high, shoulders tight. Lazaric waited. It wasn't a duel. It was a display. Within 2 passes, Lazaric had scored the first blow, a low slice across the boy's thigh that sent him stumbling. Saren caught himself, pushed forward again, tried to swing upward, but his balance failed him. Lazaric sidestepped easily and drove his boot into the boy's chest. Saren fell, breath knocked from his lungs. A murmur rose from the crowd. Aldric felt his jaw tighten. The boy got back up, again and again, each time slower, each time with more blood. Aldric looked at Henrik. The Lord said nothing. Dueling law bound them. They could not interfere. Not yet. By the 5th exchange, Lazaric had knocked the boy's blade from his hands. It landed in the dirt near the edge of the ring. Saren looked toward it, then toward his opponent, and for a moment, a long moment, it seemed he would lunge barehanded, but he didn't. He stood still, and Lazaric walked forward, slowly raising his sword. That was the moment. Aldric stepped into the ring, not fast, not in anger, just enough to stop it. Gasps rose from the watchers. Lazaric turned, surprised. He yielded, he said. You saw it. I saw him stand. Aldric replied calmly. I saw him make his choice. He was beaten. Aldric nodded. Then the duel is done. Lazaric looked past him, toward Henrik. Is this your champion now? Henrik said nothing, but Aldric didn't wait for approval. He turned his back on Lazaric, lifted Saren from the ground, and helped him from the ring. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They just watched, as if something invisible had cracked. That night, no celebration followed. No feast. No raised cups. Just silence. In the barracks, Saren sat by the fire, leg bound, hands shaking. Aldric handed him a flask and knelt beside him. You stood, he said. That matters more than you think. Saren didn't reply. He didn't need to. He had learned something men 3 times his age never did. Sometimes, honor doesn't mean winning. Sometimes, it just means not kneeling. The next day, Henrik summoned Aldric to the chapel, not the public nave, but the narrow chamber behind the altar, where the walls were thick and the air always cold. A single candle burned on the prayer stone. Henrik stood alone. You broke the duel, he said. I ended it. You shamed him. I saved him. Henrik turned slowly. You did both. There was a long pause. Then Henrik said, Karen will answer. I know. I'll be blamed. I'll be ready. Henrik looked down at the worn stones beneath their feet. I wasn't your father, but I brought you up, trained you, fed you, and you've done more than I asked, more than most would have dared. Aldric didn't speak. He waited. Which is why, Henrik said quietly, I'm sending you away. Aldric's chest stiffened. Not in exile, not in shame, Henrik continued, but because you've become the point of the blade now, and I need you to go where I can't. Not south, not to court, but east, across the borderlands. There are rumors of mercenary companies forming, nobles defecting, land barons changing, loyalties in the night. Karen's hand may be behind them, or worse, someone bigger. You want me to spy. I want you to see. Aldric took a slow breath. When? Tonight? Quietly. You'll take one man. No banner. No horse colors. Just your sword and your eyes. Aldric nodded. It was the only answer he knew. By nightfall, he rode beneath stars too bright for comfort, flanked only by a grizzled tracker named Bram, one-eyed, missing 2 fingers, but unmatched in memory of the terrain. They spoke little. The road east twisted through fields turned silver by frost and woods still wet with spring rain. At the edge of a half-burned village, they paused and found shelter in the remains of a bell tower. There, Bram unrolled a rough map, marked with hand-drawn symbols, none official. All earned. 2 nights' ride and we'll reach Derek's ford, he said. After that, no more lords, just coin and suspicion. They moved at dawn, and as the forest grew thicker, Aldric felt the weight of silence settle deeper on him. No banners, no oaths, no brothers at his side. Only the road, and the truth, that Karen was just one name, and the world beyond the duels beyond honor was far darker than the ring of any sword fight could show. Derek's ford was less a village, and more a memory of one. The river that had once drawn people to settle had changed its course long ago, leaving behind a muddy channel and a crossing of warped timbers clinging to a half-rotted frame. Moss-covered stones marked the outline of old homes, and a single chapel stood slouched near the edge of the road, its roof caved in and birds nesting in what was once the bell tower. Aldric and Bram reached it by mid-afternoon, their cloaks damp from passing mist and their horses tired. They didn't speak as they dismounted and led the animals beneath the collapsed awning of the chapel for shelter. There were no sounds except for wind through broken glass and the distant cry of crows circling high. Bram crouched near the remnants of an old hearth and began to make a small fire. His hands were quick and sure, movements born of years surviving without walls. Aldric, meanwhile, paced the edge of the clearing, eyes sweeping every shadow, noting every tree hollow and stone pile large enough to hide a blade or a man. Only once the fire crackled did Bram speak. "This place is watched." Aldric nodded. "I feel it too. They won't come now. Not until dark, and not if they think we're just passing." "We're not," Aldric said. Bram looked up. "You still think this is about Karen?" "I think Karen's a curtain, and someone else is standing behind it." Bram tossed a branch into the fire and sat back. "Then we wait." That night, as the fire dwindled and the forest thickened with shadow, the watchers revealed themselves not with blades, not with shouts, but with a single whistle, soft, high, answered by another in the trees to the left. Aldric remained still. His hand rested on his sword, but he did not move to draw. Bram stood slowly and walked to the edge of the light. "We're not soldiers," he called. "We're not tacksmen." Silence, then a voice. Calm, male. "Then you're smarter than most. Who come this way?" Figures emerged from the dark, 3, then 5. Cloaks mottled with mud and bark. No armor, no banners. But all of them armed, and all of them moving like they knew how to disappear if needed. The one who had spoken stepped forward. He was young, perhaps 30, but his eyes held the wary patience of someone who had buried more friends than enemies. He looked at Aldric. "You're not here for trade, and you don't smell like spies." "No," Aldric said. "We're here to listen." The man studied him. Then, to Aldric's surprise, he nodded once. "Then listen." They sat by the fire. Bram offered food. The others refused. They drank water from flasks made of oiled hide, and spoke only in low voices. The leader's name was Talon. No family name, or at least none he shared. He said he once fought under the banners of the Eastern Lords, but now served no one. "Not because I lost faith," he said, staring into the flames, "but because I learned where the faith ends." Aldric asked few questions. He didn't need to. Talon spoke plainly. Karen, it turned out, was only one piece, a sharp one, but not the center. There were others now, lords with coin but no land. War veterans turned mercenary captains. distant relatives of fallen houses trying to claw their way back into power. They met in abandoned halls, bargained with smugglers, bribed stewards, and promised what no honest lord could offer: immunity, coin, revenge. They don't march in armies, Talon said. They creep in, like mold. And what do they want? Aldric asked. Talon finally looked up, eyes catching the flicker of firelight. They want collapse, not victory, just ruin. Because in ruin, they can build again. And this time, not under any king. There was silence. Then he added, Karen's feeding them, but he's not leading them, not truly. He's the storm at the front, the thunder, but the wind comes from elsewhere. That night, Aldric did not sleep. He sat awake beside the embers, watching the shadows shift, and listening to the sound of wind pressing against the bones of the dead chapel. By morning, the others were gone. Only Talon remained. He gave Aldric a worn scrap of parchment, inked with a single name and place. Start there, he said. You'll find what's coming, if you're brave or foolish enough to keep looking. Aldric read the name. It was unfamiliar, a house long thought extinct, and a place deep in the marshlands, where no road passed. He folded the paper and tucked it away. They rode east again, Bram silent beside him, the sun weak above them. The land grew more wild, more broken. Villages became hamlets. Hamlets became ruins. The air turned damp, and frogs sang loud through the nights. One evening, they passed a man nailed to a tree. And oh note, just silence. Bram said nothing, but his eyes narrowed. The marshland came next, flat, cold, filled with reeds and water black as tar. They followed an old causeway marked with stone teeth, barely visible above the muck. The place marked on the parchment came into view near dusk, a manor long sunken, its walls crumbling inward, half swallowed by brackish earth, but lights flickered within, and Aldric knew they were close. That night, he watched from the trees. Figures moved inside, not soldiers, not lords, something in between. And at the center of it all, a man whose name he had read only once in a faded ledger in Henric's war room. A man long thought dead in a skirmish beyond the border. He wasn't dead, and he wasn't alone. Aldric didn't approach. Not yet. He and Bram rode back before sunrise, moving with care. Covering their tracks, they returned to Henric's keep with mud-stained cloaks and words heavy with truth. Aldric delivered the message quietly. Henrik read the names, the details, the patterns, and for the first time, he sat down. This is no longer about Karen, he said. Aldric nodded. No, he replied. It never was. The keep no longer felt like a place of strength. It had not been struck, not burned, not broken, but something within it had changed. The way the guards stood on the wall, the way the servants moved more quickly and with less noise. There was a tension now, like the drawn string of a bow that had not yet been loosed. Henrik read Aldric's report in silence. He laid the names across the war table like weapons, names long thought buried beneath older conflicts and quiet deaths. Men who had disappeared from court years ago, heirless cousins, bastards turned captains, and one man whose face still lived. In the oil portraits of a burned-out estate miles to the east, he was supposed to have drowned, Henrik said at last. 2 winters ago, fell through the ice while hunting. His brother swore it before the assembly. He lied, Aldric said. Henrik closed his eyes for a moment. Or he was made to believe it. That name, Serwyn of Valmir, meant little to most. But to Henrik, and to the others who had survived the border wars of the previous decade, Serwyn had once been a commander of some skill and even greater ambition. His house had fallen when his cousin was executed for treason, and most assumed Serwyn had vanished with it, but he hadn't vanished. He had gone underground. And now, he was building something. Karen had been the noise, the show of force, but Serwyn had been the quiet breath behind it. Henrik began to summon his closest men, not for war not yet, but for secrecy. The kind of meetings where candles were burned low, and names were spoken only once. Aldric sat beside him, speaking when asked, but mostly listening. There were maps drawn from memory, roads marked with thread and pins, whispers of towns that now flew on familiar banners. One of the oldest knights, Sir Caroline, leaned over the table one evening and tapped the edge of the marshlands with a crooked finger. "There's an old stone tower here," he said, "built long ago, abandoned. But if they're moving supplies through this channel, it would make a perfect pass-through." "They are," Aldric confirmed. "We saw remnants, empty crates, oil-stained cloth, and footsteps into the marsh that didn't return." Henrik nodded slowly. "They're setting something in motion. But what?" The answer didn't come immediately. Instead, it arrived in pieces. First, a rider arrived from the west with word that a bridge had collapsed overnight, ropes cut, beams burned, no one seen. Then a merchant caravan was found looted near the edge of the forest, their guards slain, but none of the goods taken. Just letters, correspondence, names. Then, 2 days later, a priest was found murdered outside the chapel of Droswin Hill, place where nobles once held council during the summer festivals. Pinned to his robes was a message carved into wood: "The old gods sleep, but we do not." That phrase had not been used since the faith reforms a generation ago, when cults and secret brotherhoods were pushed into the shadows. But now, they were whispering again, and Serwyn, it seemed, had given them shelter. Henrik's face darkened. "He's not building an army," he said. "He's building a cause that was more dangerous than swords, because swords rust. But ideas, they spread." Aldric knew what would come next. Not battles, not duels, but fear, mistrust, towns turning on lords, allies hesitating before answering the call, rumors faster than riders, and men, desperate for stability, accepting anyone who offered it no matter the cost. Corwin met him in the yard the next morning. The old master of arms stood leaning against a spear, the sun behind him casting long shadows. "You ever hear the tale of Prince Goric?" he asked. Aldric shook his head. "Led 20,000 men once, marched them north to break a siege. But the siege was already over, ended the night before. A boy ran 20 leagues to tell him, but the prince didn't believe it. What happened? He marched anyway, right into a trap. Took 1,000 arrows before the first sword was drawn. When it was over, they buried his army in silence." Aldric watched the dust swirl at his feet. "Is that a warning?" "It's a reminder. Don't let pride drown your ears." That evening, Aldric was called once more to the war room, but this time, not just by Henrik. 2 of the southern lords had arrived, Lords Valric and Edain. One cautious, one proud, both with enough men to tip the balance if they could be convinced. They had read the letters. They had heard the whispers, but they hadn't seen what Aldric had seen, and so he spoke. Not with force, not with fire, but with detail, of the marsh, of the ruins, of the tower where lights burned at midnight, of the names forgotten by court but alive in the wild, of the symbol carved into the priest's flesh. And he told them the most dangerous part, that Serwyn did not want war, not directly. He wanted collapse, 100 small wounds until the body no longer remembered how to fight. When he finished, the Lord sat in silence. Then Lord Edain stood. If even half of what you say is true, then the king must know. He already does, Henrik said, but his court is slow, and Serwyn is not. They agreed to stay, for now, but it was clear no one knew how long peace would hold. That night, Aldric took no rest. He walked the high wall and watched the stars. Below, in the fields beyond the torchlight, shadows moved. Not armies, but men. Watching, waiting. He didn't draw his blade, but his hand rested on it, just in case. The next morning brought a wind that smelled of ash. It rolled down from the hills in long, heavy breaths, brushing the banners on the wall with a slow, uneasy rhythm. Aldric woke before the bell, already dressed, already watching the horizon. The shadows in the valley moved differently now, not in numbers, but in silence. Even the birds had stopped singing. He walked the ramparts without speaking, nodding to the sentries who nodded back with tired eyes. No one asked if the war had begun, because no one needed to. It had already started, just not with swords. Henrik met him in the solar as the sun rose behind streaked clouds. The old lord stood by the hearth, hands behind his back, staring down at the coals. His armor was nearby, polished but untouched. "We have word from the east," he said, without turning. "Another storehouse burned. No survivors. Serwyn, or someone who wants to be him." Aldric stepped closer. "And the king?" Henrik gave a bitter smile. "Sends words, sends riders, but no steel." They stood in silence for a while, the fire crackling low between them. "Then it will fall to us," Aldric said. Henrik finally turned. "It already has." Later that day, they held council not with fanfare, but with purpose. Lord Edain and Lord Valric remained, joined by 3 others, a northern baron named Freth, gray-bearded and hawk-eyed, a lean woman named Lady Anya, whose estate bordered the highland trails, and a former commander named Marrow, no longer noble, but still respected. Maps were spread, pins placed. They spoke not of war, but of containment. Which roads to watch, which bridges to defend, which men could be trusted with secrets. Aldric spoke little, but every word landed. "They don't need to win," he reminded them. "They just need the people to stop believing anyone else can. That, more than blood, would tear the realm apart." By evening, messengers had been dispatched. Small groups rode west, others east. Supply lines were reviewed. Hidden paths reopened. The keep, once full of the easy rhythm of noble life, now moved like a beating heart under strain. Corwin resumed training the younger men, spears first, then tower shields, then low formations designed not to win but to outlast. Aldric joined them, sometimes offering corrections, sometimes just watching. He noted who faltered under pressure, who could listen under stress, who was likely to hold the line when everything else began to fall. 3 nights later, a stranger arrived at the gate. He wore no colors. His boots were caked in dried mud, his cloak stitched with patches not of fashion, but necessity. He carried a satchel, which he offered without a word. Inside, a scroll. The wax seal was unfamiliar, but the hand that had written the letter inside was not .it, was from Talon. The message was short. "They have entered the highlands, not to take land but to vanish. They are gathering, quietly, quickly. You must come." Henrik read it twice. "We'll send riders," he said. "No," Aldric replied. "I'll go." Henrik looked up. "I've seen them move. I know their signs. And Talon trusts me." Henrik hesitated. Then he gave a small nod. You ride at dawn. Take only who you trust. Aldric chose Bram, and Corwin, the older men grunted when told. Didn't think I'd be riding this far again, he said, strapping on his old sword. But I suppose if we're to see the end of the world, I'd rather see it upright. They left before first light, cloaked in gray, no banners, no insignias, just 3 men on worn horses, slipping into the folds of the land like ghosts. The road into the highlands curved steadily upward, through forests so dense the sky seemed miles away. Streams cut through mossy gullies, and birds circled high overhead. But the deeper they rode, the quieter the world became. Villages grew smaller, then vanished entirely. The wind carried only the sound of water and the occasional creak of saddles. By the 4th day, they found signs. A mark on a tree 3 slashes downward, 1 horizontal dot. It wasn't a coat of arms. It was a direction. By dusk, they came to a clearing surrounded by standing stones, half buried in bracken and root. There, Talon waited. He rose from a crouch as they approached, his face thin from travel, but eyes alert. You came, he said simply. You called. Aldric replied. They did not embrace, just nodded. Talon gestured behind him. They're gathering, beyond the ridge, not just outlaws, not just deserters, families, traders, pilgrims, people looking for something different. Corwin narrowed his eyes. Different how? They'd been promised safety, structure, order, no taxes, no kings, no hunger, just law. Serwyn's law. And they believe it? Bram asked. Talon looked away. Some don't. But they're tired. And tired men believe what lets them sleep. That night, Aldric sat by a small fire on the high ridge, staring out across the valley below. Tiny campfires flickered like stars in the grassland. Dozens. Then hundreds. No armor clanked. No banners waved. Just quiet, watchful movement. This wasn't a rebellion. It was a migration. And it was growing. Corwin sat beside him, passing a strip of dried meat between his teeth. They're not soldiers, he said. No, Aldric agreed. They're the reason soldiers get called. The next morning, they approached the edge of the valley on foot, dressed plain, weapons wrapped in cloth. Talon led them through a narrow game trail that opened into a low field where men and women were building crude shelters from branches and cloth. Some wore old house colors sewn over. Others were nothing but rag and purpose. In the center stood a makeshift hall cloth draped over wooden posts, flanked by guards in leather, not steel, and inside it, Serwyn, older than the portraits, hair longer, beard fuller, but the same cold eyes. He recognized Aldric immediately. You've come to see the end, Serwyn said. I've come to see the truth. Serwyn walked slowly toward him, hands open. Truth is simple, Aldric. The realm is broken. What we're building, what they're building, is cleaner, quieter. Corwin stepped forward. And who decides the rules? Serwyn's smile was thin. Not me, not entirely, but someone must. Why not someone who knows how the old world fell? Aldric said nothing, because he already knew what this was. Not a care, not yet, but the seed of one. And it was being planted. In the shadow of silence, that night, under stars that felt too far away, Aldric made his choice. He would not stay, he would not join, but he would return with what he had seen, and when he did there would be no more duels, only reckoning. They rode out at first light. Aldric didn't look back, not at the valley, not at Serwyn's silent camp, not at the hundreds of flickering fires that dotted the grasslands like stars fallen from the sky. He didn't need to. What he'd seen was already burned into his mind. These weren't just outcasts or traitors anymore. They were settlers, builders, convinced, quiet, ready, and that was the most dangerous kind of army. The return was slower than the ride out. They avoided the roads this time. Every branch crack sounded louder. Every rider in the distance could be a scout. And the deeper they traveled, the more Aldric felt that some invisible line had already been crossed. The realm wasn't holding. It was waiting. They reached Henric's keep by dusk on the 6th day. Horses lean and sweat-laced, cloaks dark with marsh and pine. The gates opened without question. No trumpet, no fanfare, just 3 figures returning through a world that no longer felt like theirs. Henrik met them in the lower hall. His eyes took in their silence first, then the thin film of travel on their faces, then the unreadable look behind Aldric's gaze. "Well?" he asked. Aldric didn't answer right away. He stepped forward, unwrapped a scrap of cloth from his satchel, and laid it on the stone table. Inside was a carved emblem, a symbol they'd seen burned into wood and cloth in the hidden camps. It was no coat of arms, just a hand wrapped in roots. Henrik stared at it, then whispered, "So it's true. They're not preparing to fight us," Aldric said quietly. "They're preparing to forget us." Henrik sat down slowly. Corwin leaned against a pillar, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Bram stood near the wall, his one good eye fixed on the symbol. "They follow Serwyn?" Henrik asked. "They follow his promise," Aldric replied. "No kings, no lords, just rules written in ash and silence." Henrik nodded once, slowly, then looked at Aldric. "Would you have joined them?" The question sat in the air like a drawn blade. "No," Aldric said, "because I still believe in something they've already given up on." Henrik didn't ask what that was. He already knew. Honor. Not the showy kind with banners and oaths and crowds, but the quiet kind. The kind that stays when no one else does. That night, Aldric stood at the wall again. The wind was colder now, though spring pressed on. The stars were clearer, but more distant. He watched them in silence as the keep settled into sleep behind him. Somewhere, an owl called. Somewhere farther, a dog barked, and then fell quiet. The next morning, the message arrived. It came not by rider, but by smoke. A tower on the eastern plain had been burned, not looted, not claimed, just destroyed. No bodies, no survivors. The watchmen had vanished, all 6, and once again, the mark was left behind. The hand in roots. Henrik called another council. This time, fewer came. Lord Edain sent only a letter. Lord Valric didn't reply at all. The northern Baron Freth arrived late, eyes red, saying nothing until he'd emptied half a goblet. They all saw the same thing. Not war. Collapse. Piece by piece, Serwyn was carving through the realm, not with armies, but with silence. Erasing not lands, but certainty. Aldric offered no plan, only truth. "If we fight like they want us to," he said, "we lose. Because they aren't trying to win, they're trying to unmake." "What do you propose?" someone asked. "We hold." Hold? Aldric stepped closer to the map. "We choose ground. We make it strong, unshakable, and when others fall, they'll see us still standing." Henrik nodded slowly. "We'll make our keep the line." And so they began. The work wasn't glorious. It wasn't loud. But it was steady. Walls reinforced. Stores restocked. Wells deepened. Young squires taught not how to kill, but how to listen. Guards trained not for glory, but for resilience. Runners stationed. Medicines stored. Blacksmiths worked through the night. The keep changed. It didn't become a castle of war. It became something older, a sanctuary, a symbol. Somewhere, in the silence, they hoped others would remember how to believe. Aldric, meanwhile, trained harder, but not for duels. He practiced endurance, shield formations, distance fighting, holding ground, not taking it. He began leading the youngest squires through routines that tired them, but taught them something deeper: how to stay calm when their heart pounded, how to fight without fury. One night, as he cleaned his sword in the armory, Corwin approached with the small scroll. It was from the south. A minor lord's son whom Aldric had once trained with was dead. Not in battle, not in any noble cause. He had been hung from a tree outside his father's estate. The mark again burned into the bark. Henrik read the message, then simply set it aside. "They've stopped pretending now," he said. "They never were," Aldric replied. The next day, the sky turned dark earlier than expected. Thick clouds rolled in from the west, and rain fell in long sheets, cutting through the yard and soaking the banners. The keep closed its outer gates early. Fires were lit, and the wind howled louder than it had in weeks. In the great hall, Henrik stood before the assembled captains. "When the storm passes," he said, "we ride." He didn't mean to attack. He meant to visit, village by village, hamlet by hamlet. To show presence. To remind people that not all had vanished, that someone still stood, still listened, still were still without hiding. Aldric rode at his side, and everywhere they went, people emerged from their doors, slowly, carefully, eyes wide and unsure. They said little, but they saw, and sometimes that was enough. Not always. One village had been abandoned entirely, not looted, not burned, just empty. The wind moved through it like it had found a home. Aldric stepped into the small chapel and found a single message written in ash on the altar stone. "The realm is no longer yours." He didn't reply. He simply erased it with his hand. Then they rode on. Each return to the keep brought more weight. Fewer allies replied. More villages grew silent. Yet within the walls, the heart of the realm still beat, because they hadn't stopped. Not yet. And as Aldric stood once again on the wall one quiet night, sword sheathed, eyes on the woods below, he made a quiet promise. He would hold, until there was nothing left to hold with, or until others remembered how. The weather turned colder than it should have. Even as spring edged toward summer, the nights bit through cloaks and crept beneath doorways. Fires were kept lit longer, and the watchmen along the wall began wearing gloves again, even during daylight hours. The realm was out of rhythm, as though the very air had sensed what the nobles refused to say aloud, that something beneath the soil was changing, and not for the better. Aldric awoke before the sun and walked the length of the inner wall, nodding to guards half drowsing beside torches, boots damp from dew. He said little, just watched, listened, counted how many birds had returned, how many village smoke trails still rose in the distance. Fewer every day. Henrik met him in the West Tower. Before breakfast, he held a letter, unopened. The seal bore no emblem, just wax pressed flat. Anonymity had become the preferred language of messengers in recent weeks. Aldric took it, broke the seal. Inside, only one sentence, written in small, careful hand. "They will come through the woods in 7 nights. That was all. And no name, no mark, just certainty. Henrik exhaled through his nose. "Well," he said, "they've stopped hiding. Or they want us to believe that. They've already succeeded." At that part, Henrik said, and sat slowly. "Whether it's true or not, we'll be ready. And so they prepared and horns. No calls, just quiet, layered movement. Stones reinforced, inner gates tested, arrows fletched by the dozen, barricades built behind doors that hadn't been closed in years. Corwin trained the watch not for battle, but for endurance. Rotations halved, shifts shortened, food rationed. Every captain slept in mail, every torch was watched. And Aldric, he watched the tree line. But the woods beyond the outer wall stretched far and old, branches intertwined like skeletal arms, roots like veins pushing through the cold earth. Nothing moved there, not yet, but he could feel it. The waiting, each day passed in silence, and with each one, more villagers came, not in droves, not begging, just arriving, walking from the hills, from the coasts, from the west roads, carrying children, wagons, oxen, and eyes full of quiet panic. Some were turned away, there was only so much to feed, but many were taken in, placed in storehouses, barracks, even the old chapel beneath the tower. Fires were lit in corners long cold. Aldric helped them carry their burdens. He offered no reassurances, only presence. On the fifth night, it rained, hard, the kind of rain that drowns sound and smothers fire, and through it came the knock, a single rap on the outer door. The guards froze. Aldric arrived within minutes, boots wet, cloak heavy with water. He didn't draw, he waited. Another knock. He nodded once. The door opened an inch, and standing there, soaked to the bone, was a boy no older than 12. Pale, shaking, eyes wide, in his hand a bundle. Inside it a sigil, faded, burned at the edges, the hand in roots. The boy didn't speak. He just stared. Aldric took the bundle. The boy turned, stepped off the stone path, and walked back into the dark. Bram stepped beside Aldric. That wasn't a message, he said. It was a rehearsal. Henrik read the bundle's contents that night. An old map, marked in red circles. Trails, tunnels, weaknesses. Not of the kingdom, of the keep. Aldric didn't ask how they had such detail. He already knew. Someone inside. He summoned the captains. Quietly, no panic, just facts. No one leaves alone, Aldric said. No one enters without name, Corwin added. If they come, they won't knock again. Henrik gave orders with his usual calm, but something behind his eyes had changed. Not fear, acceptance. On the sixth night, a watchman vanished. His blade was found stuck in the wall. And oh blood. And oh body. Just absence. They doubled the guard, lit more fires. Aldric didn't sleep. And then the seventh night came. And oh rain. And oh wind. Just cold. Every man stood ready, every wall manned, every gate barred, and for hours nothing. Until, just past the second bell, a shadow moved between the trees. Then another, then a dozen. And oh battle cry. No charge, just shapes, silent, sliding between trunks. Then arrows black fletched rose into the air, but they didn't strike. They landed, softly, each stuck into the courtyard's earth. At their ends. No blades, just scrolls. Aldric retrieved the nearest. Your walls will fall, not from force, from forgetting. Lay down your arms. Come and build the new law, or be buried beneath the old. Henrik read it, tossed it into the fire. They've mistaken us, he said. We're not here to win. We're here to remember. And that night, they did not sleep. They waited until dawn, but no attack came. The woods emptied again, like breath exhaled, but they knew it wasn't over. It had only begun, and Aldric, who once believed in duels and banners and codes, now stood in a world that no longer honored any of them. But he stood, not because he expected to win, but because someone had to, because someday, someone would wake in the ruins, find a wall still standing, and remember that just once someone had refused to forget what mattered. The air had changed. It wasn't colder now, but still tense, like a room just after a scream has died, or the pause before a sword is drawn in full. Even the walls seemed quieter, the firelight more hesitant, flickering not just from wind but from the weight of what had not yet happened. Aldric felt it in the way the guards looked toward the woods, in the way the horses stood without moving, ears turned toward a sound none of them could hear. No one had spoken of the scrolls again. No one needed to, but everyone had read them, and more than one had believed them. Aldric stood with Corwin in the armory that morning. The old warrior was sharpening blades not for display, but for use. His fingers were steady, his movements quiet. He hadn't spoken since dawn. "Do you think they'll come tonight?" Aldric asked. Corwin didn't look up. "Not like before. They'll wait. Let the words rot us from inside first." Aldric nodded. He already knew it. The real war hadn't been waged with swords in years. It was being fought in silence, in hesitation, in the long looks exchanged between tired men who once would have died beside each other, but now wondered if the other might leave the gate unlocked. That night, Bram caught a boy trying to slip out the north postern door. 17. A stable hand, had always been loyal, always quiet, but in his bag was a second scroll, fresh, written in the same hand. "The walls will fall. Let them." They didn't punish him, didn't hang him, didn't even speak his name. Henrik only stood in the yard the next morning and addressed the gathered men with steady calm. "If you no longer believe in the walls, then leave now, while the gate is open. But if you stay, then stay." No one moved. But something shifted. That night, fewer torches were lit. Not by order, just forgotten. Aldric doubled his own rounds. He stood longer at the walls. He watched not the woods now, but the men beside him. And then the baker disappeared. Not a soldier, not a captain, just a man with a wife and a young daughter. Gone. No trail, no prince, just his apron left folded on a stone bench near the chapel. The guards searched. Aldric rode out at dawn. Nothing. And then, 2 nights late, another. And this time, he left a note. "They offer peace. You offer memory. I choose now." Henrik read it, handed it to Aldric, and said nothing, because what could he say? They weren't losing a war. They were losing belief. Aldric sat alone in the chapel after that. No prayer, just quiet. The stone felt cold beneath him, even with the fire nearby. He watched the way the smoke curled up into the beams, the way the shadows leaned across the floor, the way dust rose in the silence, like a second breath from a place long tired of being watched. Bram entered and sat beside him. He didn't speak, either, until finally, without looking over, he said, "When the swords come, I won't be afraid." Aldric turned. "It's not the swords that worry me." Bram nodded, and they sat until the bell. The next day brought messengers, not scrolls, not threats, but refugees. Dozens, from villages that no longer existed. They brought no wagons, no animals, just cloaks and thin shoes and tired faces, and all of them wore a symbol stitched into their sleeves, a circle of thread, not the hand. Something new. Aldric met them outside the gate. They didn't ask for food or shelter. They simply asked to watch. Toc. if the old world holds, one of them said. Then we want to remember it. Henrik allowed it. Barely. They were given the old stables, the empty granary, the long unused training yard. They did not weep, did not complain. They simply stood at the edge of things, watching the keep as if it were the last fire still burning. In a long night, that night, Corwin took Aldric aside. "They're not here to stay," he said. "No, they're here to decide." Aldric nodded, and as the sky darkened once more, and the stars returned with cold indifference, the captain of the south wall approached. "There's something you need to see," he said. Aldric followed him. To the rampart, where, in the fields below, a fire had been lit, just one, not a camp, not an army, but a single torch, stuck upright in the soil, and beside it a figure, still, cloaked, staring up. Aldric narrowed his eyes, then stepped down the stairs, walked through the gate, and approached slowly. The wind was cold. The figure didn't move, but as Aldric reached within earshot, he saw the face, a woman, pale, stern, wearing no colors, and in her hand a scroll. She held it out. He took it, and then she turned and walked away, vanishing into the field as though she'd never been there. He unrolled the scroll, and "Read the final warning. The walls will hold, but you will not. You have 7 days. Then the choosing ends." Aldric read it twice, then returned to the keep, and placed the scroll on the war table. Henrik stared at it, and then, finally, broke his long silence. "We are not waiting anymore." He stood, looked to Aldric. 7 days, he said. "We build something no threat can shake." "What?" Henrik smiled, thin, but real. Conviction. And for the first time in weeks, Aldric felt it. Not hope, not safety, but purpose. Because sometimes the strongest duel isn't with the sword. It's with the soul. The first day passed quietly, too quietly. After the torch had burned down to ash in the fields beyond the walls, the woman did not return. No one came through the woods. No scrolls arrived. No riders. Not even birds crossed the airspace above the keep. It was as if the world had taken a breath and chosen not to let it out. Henrik set to work as promised, not just in drills or defenses, but in purpose. He walked the keep. He spoke to each guard by name. He visited the makeshift quarters where the watchers, the ones who had come not to fight, but to witness, now stood at windows and parapets, murmuring quietly between themselves. "Let them see what it means to hold," he told Aldric, "even if it costs us." Henrik nodded, especially then. On the second day, the baker's wife returned. She came alone. No cart, no supplies, just her and the child. Her eyes were sunken, not with tears but with emptiness. She didn't ask where he'd gone. She only asked if he'd left anything behind. Aldric handed her the folded apron. She took it, cradled it, then walked to the chapel without a word. He did not follow. On the third day, the scrolls came again, but this time, not by arrow. They were slipped beneath doorways, tied to barrels. One found beneath Corwin's bed, another inside Bram's cloak, placed while he slept. Everyone read differently, but everyone carried the same message: "Come to us, or fall with them." Some guards pretended not to have read them, others stared too long. One of the young squires, barely 15, was caught slipping out during the rain, not to escape. To burn his scroll. In the garden. "I didn't want it to touch the fire inside," he said quietly. Henrik heard about it, said nothing. The walls were still strong, but Aldric could feel them weakening in the ways that mattered, not in stone. In spirit. On the fourth day, something changed. The watchers began asking questions, not loudly, not in groups, but one by one. To the guards. To the squires. To each other. Who decides what's worth keeping? Why do you stay? What if what's coming is better? And then, finally, to Aldric, would you still defend this place if no one remembered it? He didn't answer, because he didn't know. That night, the horses grew restless. One kicked through a stall wall, another bit through the leather of its reins. Aldric spent half the night calming them. By dawn, he was tired. By noon, he was summoned. The captain of the east wall had been found dead. No blood. No sign of struggle. Just, still, slumped beside the brazier, eyes open, and in his hand clutched too tightly another scroll, this one bearing just a name, Aldric. Aldric unrolled it with shaking fingers. Inside, a single sentence: "You still have time to leave." Henrik read it, passed it to Corwin. Neither spoke. By evening, torches were relit along every wall. The wind howled, but no storm came. On the fifth day, the choosing began. The gates remained closed, but choices didn't need doors. 2 guards stepped down from their posts, laid their blades on the steps of the great hall, and walked into the chapel without speaking. Others followed. By midnight, 7 had left their stations. None had run, none had defected, but all had chosen no longer to defend. Henrik didn't chase them, he didn't punish them, he simply replaced them with fewer. That night, Aldric stood outside his own quarters, watching the flicker of flame through the slit of the chapel window. He didn't sleep, he no longer tried, and when the 6th day dawned gray, silent, cold, he knew something had turned. Bram approached him just before noon. "There's something you should see." He led Aldric not to the outer walls, not to the towers, but to the inner stairwell beneath the keep, the oldest part, where root met stone, where the air stayed damp and carried the memory of generations long gone. There, carved into the wall, was a new mark. Not the hand in roots, not the ring, but something else. A sword broken in two. Beneath it a phrase: "The last to fall never remembers why he stood." Aldric traced it with his fingers. It hadn't been carved with haste. It had taken time. Deliberate, careful. Someone inside the keep had made it. He stepped back, breathed slowly, then turned to Bram. "Bring me the roster," he said. "The full one." "Why?" Aldric stared at the mark again. "Because the enemy's no longer outside." He spent the rest of the day reading names, not crossing any, just reading, and as the sun dipped behind the western ridge, casting long shadows across the inner yard, Aldric climbed the central tower. Henrik was waiting there, watching the horizon. "I think it'll be tonight," he said. Aldric said nothing. Henrik didn't turn. "When it happens, if it happens, you'll need to carry something." "What?" Henrik reached into the folds of his cloak, handed Aldric a rolled parchment, a seal waxed in gold, the old crest, the one of the realm before it fractured. "What is it?" Aldric asked. Henrik's voice was tired, low, but steady. "The last order of the old code." Aldric held it without opening it, then looked out at the trees beyond the wall. They were swaying now, moving now, and with wind, but with something deeper. The air was shifting, and far off, too far to hear but close enough to feel. Something waited. Not armies, not banners, but a reckoning, and Aldric, who had once believed in oaths and duels and fair trials, now stood at the edge of a world that no longer wanted any of it, but he would hold, because someone had to. because sometimes the strongest defense is to stay, even when no one remembers why. They came just after the seventh bell. No horn. No warning. No thunder of who's. Just shapes half seen, half imagined moving through the woods in slow, deliberate rhythm. Shadows at first, then figures, then silence. The guards on the east wall called for readiness, but not alarm. No one screamed. No one shouted. It was not that kind of moment. This wasn't a siege. It wasn't even war. It was arrival. As if the world that had once lived inside the walls now stood outside them, returned in a different form, as if the very soul of the realm had walked out years ago, and now come back wearing a different face. Aldric stood on the main rampart with Henrik, watching the tree line shift. Below them, the torches flickered, catching the tips of spears, the hard lines of faces trained to remain calm. These weren't soldiers of ambition anymore. They were bones holding together the last shape of something that no longer had a name. And then movement. From the dark came three riders, slowly, openly, unarmed. They did not carry scrolls. They carried torches. One of them, an older man with a weathered face, lifted his arm high, and in his hand was a simple rod of polished ash wood. He didn't speak. He waited. Henrik turned to Aldric. "You'll go." Aldric nodded. Corwin joined him without being asked. They passed through the gate on foot. No one stopped them. The wind had returned, but it moved around them, not through them. At the edge of the outer path, the riders waited. The older man dismounted. First, he didn't bow. He simply said, "It's time." Aldric didn't answer. The man studied him for a long moment. There's nothing left to fight for, but something left to choose. Still, Aldric said nothing. The man continued, "They will not storm your walls. That is not how this ends. They will wait, and others will come, one by one, until you are alone." He stepped closer. "But if you leave now, if you carry your fire forward, others will follow." Aldric finally spoke. "And if I stay?" The man's face changed. Not cruel, not sad, just final. "Then you'll be the last stone they step over." He turned, mounted, rode away. The torches vanished into the woods. Aldric stood a moment longer, then turned back. At the gate, Corwin broke the silence. "Well, they're not coming to take. No, they're coming to witness the fall." That night, Henrik gathered every man, woman, and child inside the hall. Not for battle orders, but for choice. "No one will be shamed for leaving," he said. "No one will be remembered badly, but those who stay must do so knowing this is not about winning. It's about remembering." Dozens left, quietly, with respect. Aldric watched them go. Some had been beside him for years. Some had never spoken more than a few words. But now, they walked with dignity, and vanished into the night. By dawn, less than half remained. The watchers, those who had come only to see, were gone too, their chambers empty, except one, a young girl, barely 16, stayed behind. "I just wanted to know what it looked like," she said, "when something didn't fall." Aldric gave her a place in the chapel. Corwin watched the walls. Henrik closed the gates. The 6th day passed in preparation, but not the kind they'd done before. No drills, no traps, no steel. Instead, they cleaned the old banners. They rethreaded the frayed edges of the realm's sigil. They lit the long-dead brazier above the gate, and in the central square, they set the last table, the table of names. Not kings, not lords, just those who had stayed. Aldric wrote his own last. He did not tremble. The wind was rising again by evening, and somewhere in the woods, a song began, low, wordless, carried by dozens of voices. Not beautiful, not harsh, just inevitable. Corwin muttered, "They've turned this into a ritual." Aldric nodded. "They're burying what we were, before we're even gone." But neither man moved. Neither turned from the wall. That night, Henrik walked the keep. One last time, he paused at the chapel. At the granary. At the well. Then at the eastern tower where Aldric waited. "You still have the scroll I gave you?" Aldric nodded. "Don't open it yet," Henrik said. "I wasn't going to." Henrik smiled. It was tired, but real. The kind of smile only someone near the end can wear without fear. "Then tomorrow, we'll hold. Until we can't." The stars didn't show that night, and in the woods, the song continued, but no one attacked. An blade was drawn, and as the sun cracked the horizon on the seventh day, Aldric stood with the others, shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed not on death, but on memory. And he knew, this wasn't a duel. It was a testament, the last kind, the kind not written in victory or tombs, but in the act of not leaving. And so he stayed. Because someone had to. Because one stone held becomes a wall, and a wall remembered becomes a beginning. The seventh day rose with stillness so complete. It felt unnatural. No wind, no birdsong, not even the usual shifting of boots across stone, just breath, held across the keep like the entire place was waiting for a signal only it could hear. Aldric stood alone on the highest parapet, staring toward the woods that had become a second horizon. The trees were no longer mysterious, not threatening, just indifferent. They swayed lightly under the weight of something unseen, like they, too, knew the end of something was near. Below, the remaining guards stood their posts, only a handful. Now, Corwin leaned against the edge of the lower wall, his hand resting on the pommel of a blade that hadn't left its sheath in days. Bram sat on the steps beside the chapel, carving the handle of a broken spear into something that might once have been a chess piece. Henrik moved slowly through the courtyard, checking on the last fires, the food that wouldn't last another week. No orders, no speeches, just a kind of solemn grace that came from knowing your part had been played. Midday passed quietly, then the sky began to change, not with storm, but with color. A pale gray washed over the horizon, neither cloud nor smoke, something in between. It crept along the edge of the trees like fog, but thicker, deliberate, as if the air itself was giving way. Then came the figures, dozens at first, then hundreds, unarmed, unarmored, men, women, children, all walking slowly, quietly, in rows that didn't speak or gesture. They did not chant. They did not wave banners. They simply moved forward until they reached the outer wall, and stopped. They did not speak. They only watched. Aldric stood at the gate, scroll still tucked beneath his belt. He could feel it now, not fear, not resolve, but a strange quietness inside his chest. This was not a siege. This was a burial, not of bodies, but of belief. Henrik stepped beside him. "Is this it?" Aldric asked. Henrik nodded once. "This is all it ever was." Across the field, one figure stepped forward, the same woman from the torch. She carried nothing. She stopped just beyond the gate. A long silence followed. Then she spoke. "Will you open?" Henrik didn't answer. Aldric did. No, she looked at him. No anger, no sadness, just recognition. "Then this place is done." She turned and walked away, and slowly, the hundreds behind her did the same. And oh fire. And oh sword. Just departure, and with it the certainty that they would never return. Aldric watched until the trees swallowed the last figure. The keep was still, not victorious, not fallen, just left behind. That night, the fires burned low. Corwin dozed with his back against the wall. Bram's unfinished carving lay forgotten beside him. The girl who'd stayed, the last watcher, sat in the chapel doorway, staring at the empty courtyard. Henrik stood beneath the brazier above the gate. The light played across the lines of his face. He looked not like a commander, not even like a lord, just a man who had kept something standing longer than anyone thought possible. Aldric joined him. Neither spoke for a long while. Then Henrik placed a hand on Aldric's shoulder. "I'll sleep tonight," he said. "You keep the wall." Aldric nodded. Henrik descended the steps for the last time, and Aldric watched the stars return, scattered and faint above a world that had moved on. By morning, the wind had returned. It whispered through the stones, through the cracks in doors, through the tower stairs, and Aldric, who had not left his post, opened the scroll Henrik had given him all those days ago. Inside, when nothing is left to defend, remember. He folded it carefully, tucked it into his coat, and kept watch, not because they were coming, but because something had to remain for those who would one day ask what the realm had once meant. This was not a duel of blades. It never had been. This was the last stand of memory against forgetting, and Aldric a soldier not of war, but of staying held, because sometimes the last one left is not the loser, but the witness.